Welcome, gentle dreamer, to the extraordinary tale of Nami, the navigator whose dreams would chart a course through heartbreak and hope toward freedom itself. Tonight, we trace the complete journey of the woman who would map not just the world's oceans, but the very essence of loyalty, sacrifice, and the courage to trust again. From a war orphan's first breath to her place among the Pirate King's crew, this is a story written in stolen treasures and surrendered tears, in charts drawn with trembling hands and bonds forged stronger than the steel that once enslaved her. Let the rhythm of gentle waves carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore every triumph, every loss, and every moment that transformed a frightened child into the navigator who would help reshape the world. In the year 1977, 20 years before a rubber boy would declare his intention to become Pirate King, two infant girls drew their first breaths in a world already stained with the crimson of warfare. The Oikot Kingdom burned around them, another casualty in the endless cycle of conflict that consumed nations like kindling, leaving behind only smoke, ash, and the cries of those too small to understand why the sky had turned the color of blood. The battlefield stretched endlessly in all directions, a testament to humanity's capacity for destruction written in the language of broken weapons and shattered dreams. Bodies lay scattered across ground that would never again know the gentle touch of growing things. Their stories ended mid-sentence by forces too vast for any individual voice to challenge. Yet somewhere in this monument to despair, life persisted with the stubborn determination that characterizes hope in its purest form. Belmare moved through the carnage like a ghost haunted by purpose, her marine uniform torn and bloodied from battles whose objectives had long since been forgotten in the arithmetic of survival. She had come to this place as a soldier in service to abstract ideals of justice and order, but the war had stripped such concepts of their meaning, revealing them as fragile constructs that crumbled when confronted with the raw reality of human suffering. Her wounds ran deeper than the physical damage that painted her white uniform in shades of crimson. Each step sent waves of pain through her battered body, but it was the spiritual injury that truly threatened to destroy her. The growing recognition that everything she had believed about duty and honor meant nothing when measured against the simple fact of a child's cry echoing across a field of the dead. The first infant she discovered lay impossibly still amid the ruins of what had once been a home, her orange hair catching the last rays of sunlight like spun copper. The baby's breathing was so shallow that Belmare initially feared she had arrived too late, but as she lifted the child from the rubble, tiny eyes opened to regard her with an awareness that seemed far too profound for someone who had been in the world for mere days. Something in that gaze stopped Belmare's heart for a moment. Not fear or pain, but a kind of serene acceptance that spoke to depths of understanding no infant should possess. It was as if this child had been born knowing that the world was a place of beauty and horror in equal measure, and had chosen to focus on whatever beauty could be found even in circumstances that would have broken stronger souls. The second baby lay nearby, her blue hair stark against the grey ash that coated everything like a shroud. Where her sister had been preternaturally calm, this child radiated a different kind of strength, a fierce determination to live that manifested in lusty cries that echoed defiantly across the silent battlefield. Her small fists waved with the righteous anger of someone who refused to accept that this was how the world had to be. Belmare found herself kneeling between them, these two miracles who had somehow survived what had claimed so many others. The rational part of her mind catalogued the impossibility of what she was considering. A wounded Marine taking responsibility for two orphaned infants in the middle of a war zone with no resources and no clear path to safety. Every principle of military discipline demanded that she report their discovery to the appropriate authorities and continue with her mission. But the war had already killed the soldier in her, leaving behind only the woman who had once dreamed of a world where children could laugh without fear. Looking at these two babies, one contemplating the sky with ancient wisdom, the other raging against the injustice of her circumstances. Belmer saw not a burden, but a chance at redemption, an opportunity to nurture life in a world that seemed devoted to destroying it. The decision to take them came not as a moment of dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty that settled into her bones like morning dew. She would carry them away from this place of death and find somewhere they could grow into whatever they were meant to become. The Marine who had marched into battle would not be the person who walked out of it. She would become something new, defined not by service to distant authorities, but by love for two children who needed her. The journey to Kokoyasi village took weeks, each mile a test of endurance for a woman whose body was failing even as her spirit found new purpose. Belmer traveled by night when possible, avoiding the remnants of armies that still wandered the countryside like lost ghosts, carrying these precious lives toward a place she remembered from childhood stories, a village where windmills turned lazily in ocean breezes and people measured time by the rhythm of tides rather than the urgency of conflict. Kokoyasi welcomed them with the kind of unquestioning acceptance that characterized communities small enough that every member's well-being was everyone's responsibility. The villagers asked no uncomfortable questions about the circumstances that had brought a wounded Marine and two infants to their shores, instead focusing on the practical matters of healing and shelter that would transform strangers into neighbors. The house that became their home sat on a small hill overlooking the harbor, surrounded by tangerine trees that Belmer planted with her own hands during those first months of recovery. Each sapling represented a promise to the future, that these children would grow up surrounded by beauty, that they would know the satisfaction of tending growing things, that they would understand abundance, even if their circumstances remained humble. The windmill that crowned the hill became their landmark, its arms turning endlessly in the sea breeze like a compass pointing toward hope. From their windows, the girls could watch the fishing boats return each evening, their hulls heavy with the day's catch, and their crews eager to share stories of what they had witnessed beyond the horizon. It was a view that spoke to infinite possibilities, to worlds waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to seek them. As the years passed, the war that had defined Belmer's previous existence faded into memory, becoming just another story told around village fires on winter nights. The medals and commendations she had earned as a Marine gathered dust in forgotten boxes, replaced by treasures that meant far more. First words, first steps, first. Maps drawn in the sand by a child whose understanding of the world's geography seemed to emerge from some innate source of wisdom. Nami's gift revealed itself gradually, like a flower blooming in slow motion. By the age of 3, she could predict weather changes with accuracy that amazed even the village's most experienced fishermen. By 5, she was creating charts of the local coastline that surpassed anything the adults possessed in their detail and precision. By 7, she spoke of distant islands and ocean currents she had never seen as if they were familiar friends. The dream of mapping the entire world emerged naturally from these early fascinations, crystallizing into definite ambition as Nami grew old enough to understand the magnitude of what she envisioned. She would sit for hours studying the few navigation books the village possessed, her young mind absorbing principles of cartography and meteorology with the hunger of someone who had found their life's calling. When those books proved insufficient, she began creating her own, filling notebooks with observations about wind patterns and tidal flows that demonstrated understanding far beyond her years. But dreams, no matter how pure, required resources that a former Marine's modest pension could not provide. Belmer's tangerine grove produced enough fruit to feed them and generate a small income, but navigation instruments remained expensive luxuries beyond their reach. The advanced texts that could have accelerated Nami's education gathered dust in bookshops where their prices might as well have been written in foreign languages. It was during this period of creative frustration that Nami first discovered her talent for acquisition through unconventional means. The theft of her first navigation manual was born not from malice but from desperate need, the hunger for knowledge that gnawed at her like physical starvation. She told herself it was merely borrowing, that she would return the book once she had memorized its contents. But the weight of stolen knowledge felt different in her hands, carrying implications she was too young to fully understand. Belmare's discovery of this transgression led to one of their first serious conversations about the nature of right and wrong, about the difference between taking what you needed and taking what you wanted. But even as she scolded Nami for the theft, Belmare could not suppress her pride in the maps her daughter had created based on the stolen knowledge, charts so detailed and accurate that they revealed the inadequacies of the official versions used by merchant vessels. The relationship between the sisters developed along complementary lines, their different personalities creating a balance that strengthened both. Nojiko possessed the steady temperament that made her Belmare's natural partner in the practical work of maintaining their household. Her blue hair often streaked with soil from the garden she tended with religious devotion. She found satisfaction in the tangible results of physical labor, in vegetables that grew larger and sweeter under her care, in preserves that would sustain them through leaner seasons. Nami's restless energy expressed itself in constant motion and endless questions, her orange hair streaming behind her as she raced from one fascination to the next. Where Nojiko found peace in routine, Nami thrived on variety, her interests ranging from weather prediction to treasure hunting to elaborate schemes for earning the money needed to purchase the navigation equipment that remained tantalizingly out of reach. Their squabbles carried the intensity that only exists between siblings, arguments over borrowed clothes or household chores that could escalate into dramatic declarations of independence before dissolving into laughter when one of them discovered something interesting enough to demand shared attention. Belmare mediated these conflicts with the wisdom of someone who understood that the passion underlying their disagreements was actually evidence of how deeply they cared for each other. The village of Kokoyasi embraced both girls as its own, recognizing in them the next generation that would carry forward its traditions while potentially transcending its limitations. Genzo, the village policeman, appointed himself their unofficial guardian and chief source of stern lectures about the dangers that awaited young women who ventured too far from home. His warnings about pirates and marines and the general lawlessness of the wider world were delivered with the gruff affection of someone who had never had children of his own but understood their precious vulnerability. The other villagers contributed their own forms of support. Fishermen who taught Nami to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather and tide. Merchants who explained the principles of trade and negotiation that made commerce possible. Craftsmen who demonstrated the patience and precision required to create things of lasting value. Each lesson added another layer to the foundation of knowledge that would eventually support dreams too large for any single island to contain. But beneath the surface of their peaceful existence, larger forces were already moving toward convergence. The East Blue's reputation as the weakest of the four seas was about to be challenged by events that would reshape the entire world's understanding of power and possibility. Pirates were growing bolder, marines were becoming more desperate, and in the shadows, organizations with ambitions that transcended national boundaries were laying the groundwork for conflicts that would sweep away the old certainties like driftwood before a tsunami. Belmare remained unaware of these gathering storms, her attention focused on the immediate challenges of raising two remarkable children in circumstances that demanded creativity and resourcefulness in equal measure. She had found something in motherhood that military service had never provided, a sense of purpose that came not from following orders but from nurturing potential. from watching two minds develop in directions she could guide but never fully predict. The tangerine trees she had planted during their first year in Kokoyazi had grown tall enough to provide shade for the entire house, their branches heavy with fruit that carried the sweetness of dreams deferred but not abandoned. Under their canopy, two girls played games that would prepare them for adventures they could not yet imagine, drawing maps of islands that existed only in their imagination, creating charts that would one day guide them toward destinies written in the stars. The morning that would shatter Nami's world began like any other in the small house overlooking Kokoyazi's harbor, with the scent of tangerines drifting through open windows and the sound of Belle-Mère humming as she prepared their simple breakfast. The windmill's arms turned lazily in the sea breeze, casting moving shadows across the walls, where Nami's hand-drawn maps competed for space with Nojiko's pressed flowers, creating a collage of dreams and beauty that spoke to the contentment they had built in their humble sanctuary. But contentment, like the morning mist that clung to the harbor's surface, was destined to burn away under the harsh light of approaching reality. The argument that would haunt Nami for years to come emerged from the kind of mundane frustration that characterizes childhood, a dress that had been altered to fit her smaller frame, a hand-me-down, transformed with loving care, but still carrying the unmistakable mark of having been worn by someone else first. The garment itself was beautiful in its simplicity, a summer dress of soft blue cotton that Nojiko had outgrown, decorated with sunflowers that Belle-Mère had painstakingly converted into lions, with nothing more than careful stitching and artistic vision. To adult eyes, it represented resourcefulness and creativity, the ability to transform necessity into something approaching luxury through the application of skill and imagination. But to a 10-year-old girl who had begun to understand how their family differed from others in the village, it carried implications that cut far deeper than mere fashion. Nami's reaction to the dress was immediate and visceral, her young face flushing with embarrassment and anger as she held the altered garment at arm's length as if it might contaminate her with its history of having belonged to someone else. The sunflowers turned lions seemed to mock her with their cheerful optimism, symbols of a creativity born from limitation rather than choice, reminders that even Belle-Mère's considerable talents could not conjure wealth from air or transform their circumstances through will alone. The words that followed erupted from depths of frustration that Nami herself barely understood, emotions too complex for her young mind to process in any way other than striking out at the people closest to her. She spoke with the casual cruelty that only children possess, their incomplete understanding of the world, making them capable of inflicting wounds that adults would hesitate to deliver even to their enemies. "I don't want Nojiko's old clothes," she declared, her voice carrying the petulant anger of someone who had never learned to measure words against their potential for harm. "I want my own things, not hand-me-downs from someone who isn't even my real sister anyway." The phrase hung in the air like poison, each syllable designed to hurt with the precision that comes from intimate knowledge of exactly where to strike for maximum damage. Nojiko's face crumpled as if she had been physically struck, her blue eyes filling with tears that spoke to injuries far deeper than mere insult. The sister, who had shared every joy and sorrow of Nami's young life, suddenly found herself reduced to the status of stranger, her place in their small family called into question by words spoken in anger, but carrying implications that reached into the very foundation of everything they had built together. Belle-Mère's reaction was instantaneous and decisive, her hand connecting with Nami's cheek in a slap that resonated through the small house like a thunderclap. The former Marine's discipline asserted itself in that moment. The soldier she had once been emerging from beneath layers of maternal gentleness to deliver a lesson about respect and consequences that no amount of gentle correction had managed to convey. The physical sting of the slap was nothing compared to the shock of seeing Belmer's face transformed by anger and disappointment, her features hardened by emotions that Nami had never witnessed in their peaceful home. For the first time in her young life, Nami confronted the reality that love had limits, that even the most patient hearts could be pushed beyond their capacity for understanding and forgiveness. "Family isn't about blood," Belmer said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned life's hardest lessons through experience rather than theory. "Family is about choosing to love someone even when they make it difficult, about staying loyal even when it costs you something precious. Nojiko is your sister because she chooses to be, just as you are her sister because she accepts you despite your selfishness." The words struck deeper than any physical blow could have, each syllable carrying weight that pressed against Nami's chest like a stone. She had never considered that the bonds holding their small family together might be voluntary rather than inevitable, that the love she took for granted was actually a gift freely given, rather than an obligation imposed by circumstance. But pride and anger had taken root too deeply in her heart to be easily dislodged by wisdom, no matter how profound. The part of Nami that had inherited Belmer's stubborn determination chose defiance over repentance, her 10-year-old understanding of justice, demanding vindication for grievances that seemed monumental in their significance to her limited perspective. "You're not my real mother either," she shouted, the words torn from her throat with such force that they seemed to surprise even her with their venom. "If you were really my mother, I wouldn't have to wear other people's old clothes. I wouldn't have to steal books because we can't afford to buy them. If you really loved me, you would have made sure I had everything I needed, instead of making me pretend to be grateful for scraps." The silence that followed was deeper than mere absence of sound. It was the kind of quiet that descends when something precious and irreplaceable has been broken beyond any possibility of repair. Belmer's face went pale, the color draining from her features as if Nami's words had opened wounds that no amount of time could heal. In that moment, years of sacrifice and devotion were reduced to nothing more than evidence of inadequacy, love transformed into failure by the alchemy of childish resentment. Nojiko stood frozen between them, her young mind struggling to process the implications of what she was witnessing. The sister who had been her constant companion, her partner in adventure and mischief, had revealed depths of anger that called into question everything she thought she understood about their relationship. The woman who had been the only mother either of them had ever known was being attacked with weapons forged from intimate knowledge of her deepest insecurities. "Maybe you would have been happier if some rich family had found you instead," Belle, Mare said finally, her voice carrying a weariness that spoke to struggles Nami was too young to comprehend. "Maybe then you would have had everything you think you deserve, and you wouldn't have had to settle for the love of people who gave you everything they had." The permission implicit in those words, the suggestion that Nami was free to seek whatever alternative she preferred, should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like abandonment, as if the safety net that had always existed beneath her boldest adventures had suddenly been removed, leaving her to confront the possibility of falling into spaces too dark and vast for her young mind to navigate alone. "Fine," Nami declared, her voice carrying a bravado that masked the terror beginning to take root in her chest. "Maybe I will find a better family, one that can actually take care of me properly." The words were meant to wound, but they emerged hollow and unconvincing, the bluster of someone who had committed to a course of action without fully understanding its implications. She stormed from the house with the dramatic flair that only children can muster, her small feet carrying her down the hill toward the harbor, with purpose that gradually dissolved into uncertainty as the familiar landscape around her took on an alien quality. The village that had always been home suddenly felt like a collection of strangers' houses, its residents transformed from extended family into witnesses to her exile from the only sanctuary she had ever known. The dock where she had spent countless hours watching fishing boats return from their daily expeditions became her refuge, its weathered planks still warm from the morning Sunday. Genzo found her there as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, her small figure hunched over her knees as she tried to make sense of emotions too complex for her young heart to process. His approach was careful and deliberate, the gait of someone who understood that sudden movements might startle wounded creatures into flight. Running away is harder than it looks in the storybooks, he observed, settling beside her with the groaning joints of someone whose body bore the accumulated weight of years spent in service to others. His uniform was rumpled from a day of dealing with the minor disputes and domestic troubles that constituted law enforcement in a peaceful village, but his presence carried the authority of someone whose word could be trusted without question. Nami's response emerged as a mixture of defiance and desperation, her young voice carrying undertones of confusion that she was not yet mature enough to recognize. She spoke of feeling trapped by circumstances beyond her control, of dreams that seemed impossible to achieve within the constraints of their modest existence, of the burning need to prove herself capable of more than grateful acceptance of whatever scraps life chose to offer. Genzo listened without judgment, his weathered features reflecting understanding earned through decades of witnessing human nature in all its complexity. He had watched Belmer transform from broken soldier to devoted mother, had seen how love could heal wounds that medicine could not touch, had observed the gradual process by which two orphaned children had become the center of a woman's universe. "Your mother never told you the whole story, did she?" he said finally, his words carrying implications that made Nami look up from her sullen contemplation of the harbor's gentle waves. "About how she found you, about what it cost her to bring you here, about the choices she made that changed everything about who she was supposed to become." The revelation that followed transformed Nami's understanding of her origins from vague awareness into vivid reality, painting pictures in her mind of a battlefield where death had claimed everyone except two impossibly fragile infants whose survival had depended entirely on the compassion of a stranger. Genzo's words carried the weight of witnessed truth as he described Belmer's condition when she had arrived in Kokoyashi. Wounded, exhausted, carrying burdens that extended far beyond the physical weight of two babies who needed constant care. "She could have turned you over to the Marines," he explained, his voice gentle but relentless in its honesty. "Could have found families with more resources, people who could have given you advantages she knew she never could. But she looked at you both and saw something worth sacrificing everything for. Her career, her security, her plans for the future. Everything she had been before that day became less important than making sure you grew up knowing you were loved." The story continued with details that painted Belmer's devotion in shades Nami had never recognized. The nights spent walking the floors with colicky babies while her own wounds went untended, the careful budgeting that ensured they never went hungry, even when it meant she survived on nothing but determination, and the occasional charitable meal from neighbors who understood sacrifice when they saw it. Each anecdote built upon the last, creating a portrait of selflessness so complete that it made Nami's earlier complaints seem petty and ungrateful. "The dress that made you so angry," Genzo said, his words carrying the patient tone of someone determined to complete a difficult lesson, "represents the same thing as everything else in your house. Love finding ways to provide what's needed, even when resources are limited. Belmare didn't alter Nojiko's old clothes because she was too cheap to buy you new ones. She did it because taking something that had been worn with love and transforming it into something new meant that both her daughters would always be connected to each other, that neither of you would ever truly be alone. The tears that finally came carried with them the release of emotions too powerful for Nami's young heart to contain. Shame at her cruelty, gratitude for sacrifices she had never recognized, fear that she might have damaged something too precious to repair through thoughtless words spoken in anger. The sobs that racked her small frame were violent in their intensity, as if her body was trying to expel poison that had taken root in her soul. Nojiko found them there as the sun touched the horizon, her approach tentative but determined, her face bearing the signs of her own tears, but also the resolution of someone who had made difficult decisions during her sister's absence. The blue-haired girl who had been maligned as not real family carried herself with a dignity that belonged to someone far older than her years, her manner suggesting that she had spent the afternoon wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. "Belmare told me the truth," she said simply, her voice carrying none of the anger or resentment that Nami might have expected. "About the war, about how we were found, about everything she gave up to make sure we had a home. She thought we were old enough to know, especially after what happened today." The sisters regarded each other across a distance that measured more than physical space. The gap created by morning's cruel words suddenly feeling vast enough to contain oceans. But Nojiko's next action bridged that distance with grace that spoke to wisdom beyond her years. She sat beside Nami on the weathered dock, close enough to offer comfort without demanding immediate forgiveness, present without being intrusive. "I don't care that we're not blood sisters," Nojiko continued, her words carrying conviction that made them impossible to dismiss as mere politeness. "I don't care that Mare isn't our birth mother. They're our family because they chose to be, and that makes it more special, not less. Anyone can be stuck with relatives they didn't pick, but we got to be chosen by people who wanted us enough to change their whole lives." The wisdom in those words penetrated defenses that had been weakened by shame and exhaustion, finding fertile ground in a heart that had always known the truth, but had temporarily lost sight of it under the pressure of childish disappointments. Nami's anger dissolved like morning mist, leaving behind clarity that revealed her earlier behavior in its true light. Not righteous indignation, but selfish ingratitude. Not justified complaints, but cruel attacks on people whose only crime had been loving her despite her flaws. The walk home occurred in silence, broken only by the evening sounds of a village settling into night. Fishing boats returning with their catches. Families gathering for dinner. Children being called in from their play before darkness made the harbour paths treacherous. Each familiar sound served as reminder of the community that had embraced them, the extended family that had helped raise them, the web of relationships that had made their unconventional household possible. Belmare was waiting in the kitchen when they arrived, her face bearing signs of her own emotional struggle, but also the resolution of someone who had decided that difficult truths could no longer be postponed in service to protecting childhood innocence. The conversation that followed would have been impossible earlier that day, but the events of the afternoon had created space for honesty that had not previously existed. The apologies that needed to be spoken were offered and accepted with the gravity that such moments require. Words of regret, meeting words of forgiveness, in the careful dance that allows relationships to heal from wounds that might otherwise prove fatal. Belmare's embrace carried forgiveness that transcended the hurt she had endured, love that remained constant despite evidence that it might not always be appreciated or reciprocated. But even as their small family began the process of mending what had been broken, larger forces were already moving toward their peaceful village, carrying with them changes that would make the morning's domestic drama seem insignificant by comparison. The argument about hand-me-down clothes would soon be revealed as luxury of safety, the kind of normal family conflict that was only possible when survival itself was not in question. The approaching storm would test every lesson they had learned about love and loyalty, would demand sacrifices that made Belmer's daily compromises seem trivial, would reveal the true cost of choosing family over everything else. The words spoken in anger on this day of reckoning would pale beside the choices that lay ahead, decisions that would determine not just who they were to each other, but whether they would have the chance to be anything at all. The last peaceful night in Kokoyashi village was settling over them like a gentle blanket, unaware that dawn would bring visitors whose arrival would transform their understanding of what family meant and what prices love might demand from those brave enough to claim it as their own. The dawn that broke over Kokoyashi village 8 years before Monkey D. Luffy would first set foot on its shores, carried with it the weight of transformation. Though none who witnessed the sunrise could have predicted how completely their world was about to change. The argument between Nami and Belmer had been forgotten in the face of more immediate concerns. The presence of ships on the horizon that flew no familiar flags, vessels that moved with the predatory grace of hunters, rather than the purposeful efficiency of merchants or the protective formations of marine patrols. Arlong's arrival had been preceded by reports that filtered through the network of fishing villages like poison spreading through clean water. Stories of a fishman pirate whose hatred for humans exceeded even the considerable animosity that characterized most interactions between the species. The tales spoke of systematic brutality that went beyond simple piracy into something approaching genocide. Communities left devastated not just economically, but spiritually, their populations reduced to trembling shadows of their former selves. But reports, no matter how detailed or disturbing, could not adequately prepare anyone for the reality of witnessing Arlong himself stride through Kokoyashi's peaceful streets like a force of nature given malevolent consciousness. His massive form towered over the humans who had gathered to witness this unprecedented invasion. His shark-like features twisted into an expression that suggested amusement at their obvious terror. The saw-shaped nose that had given him his name caught the morning light like a weapon, which in many ways it was. The tribute he demanded was presented not as negotiation, but as inevitable fact. 100,000 berries per adult, 50,000 per child. Payment required monthly for the privilege of continued existence. The amounts were carefully calculated to be possible but crushing, enough to keep the population alive and productive, while ensuring they could never accumulate sufficient resources to mount effective resistance or escape to somewhere beyond his reach. For most of Kokoyashi's residents, the mathematics of survival were straightforward if bitter. Find ways to generate the required funds through whatever means necessary. Accept the transformation from free citizens to livestock, managed by a predator whose mercy was conditional on their continued utility. The fishermen would fish, the farmers would farm, the merchants would trade, and all would surrender the fruits of their labor to purchase another month of breathing. But for Belmer, the calculations were more complex and infinitely more personal. The tribute demanded for herself was manageable, barely, through careful budgeting and the sacrifice of every comfort that distinguished living from mere survival. The additional amounts required for Nami and Nojiko, however, created an equation that had no solution within the boundaries of legal income or honest labor. The choice she faced in those terrible moments was both impossible and inevitable. Deny her relationship to the girls she had raised as daughters and watch them face an uncertain fate as unclaimed orphans in a world suddenly ruled by casual cruelty, or acknowledge their bond and condemn all three of them to certain death when she failed to produce funds that did not exist. Love demanded she claim them regardless of consequences, but love also demanded she ensure their survival by whatever means possible. Standing in her modest kitchen with Arlong's shadow falling across the threshold like a promise of coming darkness, Belmer made the decision that would define the remainder of her tragically shortened life. Her voice carried none of the uncertainty that might have been expected from someone facing impossible odds. Instead, it rang with the clarity that comes from perfect understanding of what truly matters when everything else has been stripped away. "These are my daughters," she declared, her words transforming what could have been tactical retreat into final stand. "I will pay their tribute as well as my own, because that is what mothers do. They protect their children, regardless of the cost." The statement carried weight that went beyond mere defiance, representing the conscious choice to value love above life, family above survival, hope above the cruel arithmetic that governed transactions between the strong and weak. Arlong's reaction revealed the depths of his understanding about human nature and its exploitable weaknesses. He could have simply killed all three and moved on to extract tribute from the remaining villagers, but the former marine's display of maternal devotion had given him something potentially more valuable than immediate payment, leverage that could be applied with surgical precision to achieve goals that brute force alone could never accomplish. His examination of the maps that covered Nami's bedroom walls was casual at first, the idle curiosity of someone passing time while subordinates handled the mundane details of establishing control over another conquered territory. But as his eyes traced the careful lines and precise annotations that characterized her cartographic work, his attention sharpened with the focus of a predator, recognizing unexpected opportunity. The charts represented skill that went far beyond childhood hobby or academic exercise. They demonstrated intuitive understanding of oceanographic principles that most adults never mastered, weather prediction capabilities that bordered on supernatural, artistic ability that transformed functional documents into works of beauty. For someone whose ambitions extended beyond simple piracy into empire building, such talent represented a resource too valuable to waste through conventional methods. The bargain he offered Belmer was structured with the cynical genius that characterized all his dealings with humans. Hope dangled just close enough to seem achievable, while remaining distant enough to ensure years of profitable servitude. 100 million berries would purchase Kokoyashi village's freedom from his tribute system, but the sum would have to be delivered by someone whose skills made her uniquely qualified to obtain it through methods that served his larger interests. Nami's conscription into the Arlong pirates was presented not as kidnapping but as employment opportunity, a chance for exceptional talent to receive proper recognition and compensation within an organization that valued ability above sentiment. The twisted logic of his proposal made it seem almost generous. Rather than simply killing everyone who could not pay their tribute, he was offering a path to salvation that required only temporary separation and the application of gifts that would otherwise remain undeveloped. The moment when Belmer understood the true nature of what was being offered played out in the space between heartbeats, recognition dawning in her eyes like sunrise over a battlefield. She could refuse and watch her daughters die alongside her in a gesture of meaningless nobility. Or she could accept and trust that love could survive whatever transformations might be required to preserve life itself. Her final words to Nami were chosen with the care that comes from knowing they would have to last forever, each syllable weighted with the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned through bitter experience that survival sometimes demanded compromises that noble principles would never accommodate. She spoke of happiness waiting beyond current suffering, of the importance of living long enough to see better days, of the faith she maintained that strength and determination could overcome any obstacle when properly applied. The shot that ended Belmer's life echoed across Kokoyasi village like thunder, its reverberations carrying implications that would reshape every relationship and redefine every priority in the community she had died protecting. The woman who had found 2 orphaned infants on a battlefield and transformed them into family through nothing more than conscious choice had made her final decision in the same spirit, choosing love over life, hope over despair, future over present. Nami's integration into the Arlong pirates began immediately, before shock could crystallize into resistance or grief could paralyze her capacity for adaptation. The tattoo that marked her as crew member was applied with ceremonial precision. The needles bite nothing compared to the pain of watching her mother's blood stain, the kitchen floor where they had shared so many meals. The Jolly Roger that now decorated her shoulder served as both identification and warning. She belonged to forces that had demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who interfered with their operations. The role assigned to her within Arlong's organization was carefully designed to maximize both her utility and her isolation from sources of emotional support that might interfere with her efficiency. As navigator and cartographer, she would be essential to their expansion throughout the East Blue, her maps enabling conquests that would have been impossible without precise knowledge of currents, reefs, and weather patterns. But her value also made her a prisoner in all but name, too important to risk losing through sentiment or misguided loyalty to her origins. The return to Kokoyasi village that followed her initial capture was staged with theatrical precision, designed to complete the psychological transformation that physical coercion alone could never achieve. Nami's appearance before the assembled villagers who had known her since infancy was choreographed to destroy every relationship that might have provided sanctuary from her new reality, to burn bridges that might otherwise have offered paths back to the person she had been before tragedy redefined her existence. The money she displayed as proof of her willing collaboration with Arlong's forces represented her first payment for services rendered, funds obtained through methods that she was already beginning to master despite her youth and inexperience. The skills that had once been channeled into creating beautiful maps of imaginary islands were now applied to the darker art of separating pirates from their treasures, using their own greed and carelessness against them with efficiency that impressed even her captors. Nojiko's attack on her sister was born from grief and disbelief rather than genuine hatred, the desperate action of someone whose world had been reduced to rubble in the space of a single morning. The sister, who had been her constant companion, her partner in every adventure, and confidant in every secret, was being presented as willing collaborator with the monsters who had murdered their mother and enslaved their community. The blow that knocked Nami to the ground carried all the accumulated pain of watching everything precious be systematically destroyed, but it also served as the final severing of connections that Arlong needed to eliminate if his new navigator was to function with proper focus. The betrayal had to appear complete and mutual, the rejection absolute, the transformation from beloved daughter and sister to despised enemy accomplished with such thoroughness that return would seem impossible. Genzo's pronouncement that Nami would never again be welcome in Kokoyasi village was delivered with the authority of someone who understood that some performances required commitment that went beyond mere acting, that survival sometimes demanded embracing roles that violated every instinct about justice and loyalty. His words carried the weight of necessary cruelty, protection disguised as rejection, love expressed through apparent abandonment. The exile that followed was both real and fabricated, genuine in its emotional impact while serving purposes that none of the participants could safely acknowledge. Nami's departure from the village that had been her only home was witnessed by people who had known her since infancy, their faces reflecting mixtures of disappointment and disgust that cut deeper than any physical wound could have managed. The child who had once charted imaginary voyages to islands of wonder was now embarking on a journey that would test every assumption she had ever held about right and wrong. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of compartmentalized existence, each day requiring her to maintain multiple personas that could never be allowed to intersect without risking the careful balance that kept everyone she cared about alive. To Arlong and his crew, she was the navigator whose skills had made their expansion possible, the human whose intelligence was valuable enough to earn grudging respect despite her inferior species. To the pirates she robbed, she was either ally or victim depending on what the situation required, her apparent youth and innocence serving as camouflage for abilities that would have been threatening in someone whose appearance suggested competence. But to herself, in the moments of solitude that came between performances, she remained Belmer's daughter and Nojiko's sister, the keeper of dreams too precious to abandon despite circumstances that made their fulfillment seem impossible. The maps she created for Arlong were technical masterpieces that served his purposes efficiently, but the maps she drew in private carried notations that had nothing to do with military strategy or territorial expansion. They marked the locations of villages that deserved protection, currents that could carry messages to allies, islands where someone seeking freedom might find sanctuary. The treasure she accumulated through 8 years of carefully orchestrated theft was hidden in the place that held the most meaning for her, Belmer's Tangerine Grove, where the trees continued to bear fruit that carried the sweetness of memories from happier times. Each handful of berries buried beneath the roots represented another step toward the impossible goal that Arlong had established as the price of Kokoyasi's freedom, but also evidence that hope could survive, even in circumstances designed to crush it completely. The count that she maintained with obsessive precision became both torment and comfort. 7 million berries in the first year, 18 million by the end of the second, 34 million after the third. The numbers represented more than mere currency. They were measurements of endurance, proof that she had not surrendered to despair despite every incentive to abandon the struggle as futile. The relationship between the sisters evolved during these years into something that required constant translation between public performance and private truth. Nojiko's apparent hatred masked understanding deeper than words could convey, her rejection providing cover for support that had to remain invisible to observers who might report suspicious behavior to authorities whose mercy was non-existent. The blue-haired girl who had once shared every secret now became the guardian of the most important secret of all, that Nami had never truly betrayed anyone except in ways necessary for survival. The villagers' treatment of their former favorite daughter was calibrated to maintain the fiction that Arlong required while preserving whatever fragments of community could survive under occupation. Their cold shoulders and whispered condemnations served dual purposes, convincing watching fishmen that the human population had properly internalized their subjugation, while communicating to Nami that her sacrifices were recognized and valued, even if they could never be acknowledged openly. Genzo's evolution from protective father figure to apparent enemy was perhaps the most difficult performance required by their circumstances. His natural instincts to shield her from harm, constantly warring with the recognition that genuine protection now required maintaining distance that appeared absolute. The police officer who had once lectured her about staying away from dangerous tide pools was now forced to treat her as the most dangerous presence in their community. His every interaction with her calculated to reinforce the narrative that their relationship had been permanently severed. The weight of carrying so many secrets while maintaining so many deceptions began to accumulate like sediment in a harbor, gradually changing the fundamental nature of who Nami was becoming. The girl who had once drawn maps as expressions of wonder at the world's infinite possibilities was learning to see those same waters as obstacles to be navigated with utmost care, potential sources of death for anyone whose loyalty to her might be discovered by the wrong observers. Yet despite the isolation and the constant fear and the grinding exhaustion of maintaining multiple identities, she never lost sight of the ultimate objective that gave meaning to every compromise and justified every betrayal. The 100 million berries that would purchase Kokoyasi's freedom remained as distant as the stars, but also as constant, a fixed point in the darkness that could guide her through whatever trials lay ahead. The maps she created during these years were masterpieces of their kind, technical documents that combined artistic beauty with practical utility in ways that made them valuable far beyond their immediate purpose. But they were also love letters written in the language of longitude and latitude, messages addressed to a future where freedom would make honesty possible again, where the navigator who had learned to chart courses through treacherous waters could finally set sail toward horizons that held promise instead of peril. The morning when destiny first brushed against Nami's carefully constructed world arrived, disguised as routine. Another day in the endless sequence of performances that had defined her existence since childhood's abrupt termination 8 years earlier. She moved through Orangetown's crowded marketplace with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to navigate between identities like a ship threading narrow channels. Her appearance calculated to project exactly the right combination of innocence and competence that would make her next target comfortable enough to be careless. The treasure map she had liberated from Buggy the Clown's collection represented more than mere theft. It was a masterpiece of cartographic art that depicted the Grand Line's treacherous waters with accuracy that few navigators could match. The document's value extended far beyond the monetary worth of whatever riches it might lead to. It represented knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for anyone foolish enough to challenge the most dangerous ocean in the world without proper preparation. The deception she had orchestrated to acquire the map demonstrated skills honed through years of necessity, her ability to manipulate greed and overconfidence having been refined to an art form that would have impressed masters of the craft. The pirates who had pursued her through Orangetown's winding streets believed themselves to be chasing easy prey, a young woman whose apparent vulnerability made her seem like the perfect victim for their particular brand of casual cruelty. But appearances, as Nami had learned through bitter experience, were weapons that could be wielded with surgical precision by those who understood their power. The helpless girl fleeing through the marketplace was a carefully constructed fiction designed to lead her pursuers exactly where she needed them to be. Her seemingly panicked flight, actually a calculated maneuver that would position them for the trap she had spent days preparing. The moment when Monkey D. Luffy fell from the sky like a gift from whatever gods watched over thieves and dreamers marked the first crack in the wall Nami had built around her heart to protect it from the luxury of hope. His arrival was so unexpected, so completely outside the parameters of any plan she might have conceived, that it temporarily shattered the emotional discipline she had maintained for nearly a decade. The rubber boy's emergence from the smoking crater he had created upon impact should have been impossible according to every law of physics she understood, yet there he stood, brushing dust from his clothes with the casual air of someone for whom defying natural law was merely another Tuesday afternoon activity. His first words weren't threats or demands, but simple confusion about who had dared to attack him, his tone suggesting genuine puzzlement rather than anger at the interruption to whatever adventure had been occupying his attention. The opportunity that his unexpected arrival represented was too perfect to ignore, despite every instinct warning her that involving civilians in her operations typically led to complications that could prove fatal for everyone concerned. Yet something in Luffy's manner suggested that he might be capable of surviving encounters that would destroy ordinary people. His casual attitude toward violence and apparent immunity to physical damage, marking him as potentially useful rather than merely another liability to manage. Her designation of him as boss was calculated to stroke whatever ego he might possess while establishing a dynamic that would make him feel responsible for protecting her from the pirates who were rapidly closing in on their position. The performance required careful calibration. Too much deference would seem suspicious. Too little would fail to engage his protective instincts. But the right balance would transform him from random bystander into willing accomplice without him realizing the manipulation had occurred. The pirates who surrounded them represented exactly the kind of low-level thugs that Nami had been avoiding and exploiting for years. Men whose intelligence had been compromised by too much drink and too little success, whose desperation made them dangerous in close quarters, but whose lack of imagination made them predictable in their tactical choices. They moved with the swagger of people who had convinced themselves that numbers alone guaranteed victory. Their confidence built on encounters with victims too weak or too frightened to offer meaningful resistance. The casual violence of their attack on Luffy, striking him hard enough to knock his straw hat from his head, revealed depths of stupidity that made Nami wonder how they had survived long enough to become pirates in the first place. The hat was obviously precious to him, its careful maintenance and prominent placement suggesting sentimental value that went far beyond its modest material worth, yet they had treated it like debris to be casually swept aside. Luffy's transformation from confused bystander to avenging force of nature occurred in the space between one heartbeat and the next, his rubber body moving with fluid grace that made the pirates' crude brawling techniques seem like the flailing of children. The power he displayed was unlike anything Nami had witnessed during her years of observing combat between various criminal factions. Not the overwhelming strength of someone like Arlong, but something more fundamental, as if the very concept of defeat had never occurred to him as a possibility. The ease with which he dispatched 3 armed men without apparent effort or malice marked him as someone operating on a completely different level from the ordinary pirates who infested the East Blue's waters. His movements carried the efficiency of someone who had trained extensively, but also the creativity of someone who approached each fight as a unique puzzle to be solved, rather than a ritual to be performed according to established patterns. Her introduction of herself as a thief who specialized in robbing pirates was calculated to establish common ground, while revealing enough truth to make any subsequent lies more believable. The admission of criminal activity serving as foundation for whatever partnership she might be able to construct from this unexpected encounter. The revelation that her targets were specifically pirates rather than innocent civilians was designed to appeal to whatever moral framework guided his actions, positioning her activities as vigilante justice rather than simple robbery. But Luffy's reaction to learning about her profession revealed complexities that she had not anticipated. His immediate enthusiasm for the idea of teaming up with someone whose skills complemented his own, suggesting either remarkable naivety or sophisticated understanding of how such partnerships could benefit both parties. His willingness to trust someone he had just met spoke to either dangerous innocence or supreme confidence in his ability to handle whatever betrayals might emerge from such alliances. The discovery that he was himself a pirate should have ended their temporary partnership before it could truly begin. Every lesson of her childhood and adolescence screaming warnings about the dangers of associating with anyone who flew the Jolly Roger. Pirates had destroyed her family, enslaved her village, and transformed her life into an endless series of performances designed to keep the people she loved alive through whatever compromises might be required. Yet something in Luffy's manner suggested that he represented a different category of pirate entirely, someone whose understanding of what it meant to sail under the black flag bore no resemblance to the casual cruelty that characterized most of the breed. His dreams of adventure and treasure seemed to emerge from childhood fantasies rather than adult appetites for domination and destruction. His entire approach to piracy appearing to be based on storybook romanticism rather than harsh reality. The betrayal that followed was necessary for maintaining her cover while gathering intelligence about this unusual individual, her decision to turn him over to Buggy representing careful calculation rather than simple treachery. If he was as naive as he appeared, he would likely die quickly, and her conscience would be troubled but not devastated. If he possessed hidden depths that matched his apparent physical capabilities, he would find ways to survive and perhaps even prove useful in future operations. The cage that contained him within Buggy's stronghold provided perfect opportunity for observation without the complications that direct interaction might create. Her position as temporary member of the Clown Pirates, allowing her to study his reactions to captivity and evaluate his potential for the kind of desperate ingenuity that survival in the Grand Line would require. Most prisoners in his situation would have spent their time pleading for mercy or raging against their fate. But Luffy seemed genuinely curious about his surroundings rather than concerned about his prospects. Her infiltration of Buggy's crew represented familiar territory, the kind of deception that she had mastered through years of practice, with targets whose intelligence and paranoia varied widely, but whose fundamental weaknesses remained remarkably consistent. Pirates were generally easy to manipulate because their lifestyle attracted people who preferred simple solutions to complex problems, individuals whose emotional needs could be exploited by anyone who understood the psychology of belonging and acceptance. The performance required to convince Buggy of her loyalty was complicated by his devil fruit abilities and theatrical personality, his tendency toward dramatic gestures and elaborate schemes demanding responses that matched his energy while avoiding the kind of overacting that might trigger his suspicions. The clown's reputation for unpredictable violence meant that even small mistakes could prove fatal. Yet his ego also created opportunities for manipulation by anyone willing to provide the admiration and validation that his personality craved. The order to execute Luffy as proof of her commitment to the crew was exactly the kind of test that Nami had been dreading, forcing her to choose between maintaining her cover and preserving the life of someone who had shown her unexpected kindness, despite having every reason to distrust her motives. The moment stretched like an eternity, as she weighed options that all seemed to lead toward outcomes she was not prepared to accept. The decision to free him instead of following Buggy's commands marked the first time in years that she had chosen immediate conscience over long-term strategy. Her carefully maintained emotional discipline cracking under pressure from moral imperatives that she had thought were safely buried beneath layers of pragmatic calculation. The key that unlocked his cage also unlocked something in herself that had remained dormant since the day Arlong had murdered her mother. Zoro's arrival provided the external justification she needed for actions that her survival instincts recognized as dangerously impulsive. The swordsman's reputation for strength and honor, offering hope that their small group might actually possess sufficient power to escape from circumstances that should have proven fatal. His immediate acceptance of the situation and willingness to engage Buggy in combat suggested either remarkable confidence or equally remarkable stupidity, but either quality might prove useful in the chaos that was about to unfold. The battle that followed revealed layers of complexity in both Luffy and Zoro that made them far more formidable opponents than their casual attitudes had suggested. Their coordination in combat, speaking to shared understanding of tactics and timing that could only come from extensive experience fighting together. The ease with which they dismantled Buggy's initial attacks demonstrated skills that placed them in categories far above the ordinary pirates who infested East Blue waters. Buggy's revelation of his devil fruit powers should have shifted the tactical balance decisively in his favor. His ability to separate and control his body parts, creating combat scenarios that conventional fighters would find impossible to counter effectively. The immunity to cutting attacks that his Barabara Nami provided made Zoro's swords useless in direct confrontation, while his capacity for unexpected angles of attack turned every moment of the fight into potential disaster for his opponents. Yet rather than being discouraged by these revelations, Luffy and Zoro adapted their strategies with creativity that transformed disadvantages into opportunities. Their willingness to embrace unconventional approaches, allowing them to find solutions that more traditional fighters might never have considered. The teamwork they displayed suggested partnership built on mutual respect and genuine understanding, rather than simple convenience or shared desperation. Nami's role in their eventual victory was smaller than she might have preferred, but more significant than she had expected. Her quick thinking and knowledge of Buggy's psychological weaknesses, providing the crucial advantages that allowed her unexpected allies to press their attack when the clown pirate's attention was divided. The satisfaction she felt at contributing to his defeat was complicated by recognition that she had crossed lines that might prove difficult to uncross. The escape from Orange Town that followed was accomplished with efficiency that spoke to Luffy's experience in making rapid departures from locations where his presence had become unwelcome. His casual approach to what should have been desperate flight, suggesting that he viewed such situations as routine rather than exceptional. The small boat that carried them away from the burning wreckage of their conflict with Buggy's forces was hardly luxurious, but it represented freedom from immediate danger and opportunity to evaluate what their brief partnership might have revealed about future possibilities. The map of the Grand Line that she presented to Luffy as payment for his assistance was valuable beyond its immediate practical applications, representing her first genuine gift to another person in years rather than calculated investment in future returns. The knowledge contained within its carefully drawn borders could mean the difference between life and death for anyone brave enough to challenge the world's most dangerous waters. Yet she offered it freely as acknowledgement that some debts could not be measured in monetary terms. Luffy's reaction to receiving the map was characteristically enthusiastic but also surprisingly thoughtful, his recognition of its true worth suggesting depths of understanding about navigation and seamanship that his casual attitude toward most subjects might not have indicated. The care with which he handled the precious document spoke to respect for expertise and appreciation for craftsmanship that marked him as someone who understood the difference between valuable things and truly priceless ones. The partnership that emerged from their Orange Town adventure was tentative and carefully defined. Her agreement to travel with them, for the time being, representing compromise between her need for allies and her determination not to become emotionally invested in relationships that circumstances might force her to abandon. The flexibility built into their arrangement would allow her to depart whenever her real priorities demanded attention, while providing temporary sanctuary from the isolation that had defined her existence for so many years. Chushu's intervention during their escape from Orange Town's angry residents provided unexpected assistance from a source that had no obligation to help strangers, the loyal dog's actions serving as reminder that loyalty and courage existed in forms that had nothing to do with species or circumstance. The animal's devotion to his dead master's memory offered lessons about the power of love to transcend death and inspire action, even when logic suggested that such efforts were meaningless. Mayor Boodle's gratitude, despite his initial unconsciousness, spoke to the kind of leadership that Nami had rarely encountered during her years of observing various power structures. His willingness to acknowledge debt, even when he had not been conscious, to witness the actions that created it, suggesting integrity that was becoming increasingly rare in a world where strength typically determined right and wrong. His thanks carried weight that went beyond mere politeness to encompass recognition of genuine service performed without expectation of reward. The treasure that Luffy had deliberately left behind as contribution to Orangetown's rebuilding efforts revealed aspects of his character that complicated every assumption Nami had made about his motivations and priorities. His casual generosity with wealth that represented significant value, suggesting either remarkable naivety about money's importance or sophisticated understanding of priorities that transcended material concerns. The gesture was simultaneously admirable and infuriating, representing exactly the kind of impractical idealism that she could not afford to indulge while carrying responsibilities that demanded every available resource. Yet even as she threatened him for his reckless charity, part of her recognized that his actions represented everything she had been forced to abandon in service to survival: the luxury of considering others' needs above immediate self-interest, the freedom to value abstract principles above concrete necessities, the privilege of believing that the world contained enough abundance to share without carefully calculating the costs of every gesture. The warning she delivered about never repeating such behavior was designed as much to protect herself from the dangerous temptation of his example as to educate him about practical realities that his privileged upbringing had apparently failed to teach. She could not afford to be influenced by someone whose moral certainty might undermine the careful compromises that kept her mission viable, yet neither could she deny the appeal of his unwavering conviction that doing right was more important than doing well. As their small boat carried them away from Orangetown toward whatever adventures awaited beyond the horizon, Nami found herself caught between familiar cynicism and unexpected hope, her carefully maintained emotional discipline under assault from possibilities that she had not allowed herself to consider for nearly a decade. The partnership she had entered might prove temporary and tactical, but it had already begun to awaken parts of herself that she had thought were safely buried beneath layers of necessary deception and survival-focused pragmatism. The boy who dreamed of becoming Pirate King and the swordsman who sought to become the world's greatest had accepted her as partner without demanding explanations or guarantees that she was not prepared to provide. Their trust offered freely, despite every reason for suspicion. Such faith was either dangerous naivety or remarkable wisdom, but either way it represented something she had not experienced since childhood, the possibility that she might be valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. The return to Kokoyashi village after nearly a decade of exile carried weight that transformed familiar landmarks into monuments to everything Nami had lost and everything she still hoped to reclaim. The windmill that had once marked home from any distance now stood as sentinel over a community that bore the scars of prolonged occupation, its arms turning with the same steady rhythm, but casting shadows over streets where laughter had been replaced by the cautious whispers of people who had learned that joy could be dangerous when witnessed by the wrong observers. The harbor where she had once drawn imaginary maps in the sand while dreaming of adventures beyond the horizon was now dominated by the massive bulk of Arlong Park, its grotesque architecture serving as constant reminder of the power that ruled their lives and the price that would be extracted for any display of defiance. The fortress that the Fishman pirates had constructed on the ruins of her childhood playground was designed not just for defense but for psychological impact, its towers and walls declaring to everyone who saw them that the natural order had been permanently overturned. The companions who had followed her from their various adventures remained mercifully unaware of the personal stakes that had drawn her back to this place, their presence representing both comfort and complication, as she prepared to confront realities that no amount of preparation could make bearable. Luffy's enthusiasm for new challenges and Zoro's readiness for combat were assets that might prove invaluable in the trials ahead. Yet their very loyalty created vulnerabilities that Arlong would not hesitate to exploit if he recognized their importance to her carefully maintained equilibrium. The village's reaction to her return was choreographed with precision born from years of practice, each resident playing their assigned role in the theater of rejection that had kept her true mission hidden from observers whose suspicions could prove fatal for everyone involved. The cold shoulders and whispered condemnations that greeted her arrival were painful but necessary, evidence that the community understood the stakes and remained committed to the deception that had preserved their collective survival. Genzo's harsh words cut deeper than any physical wound could have managed. His transformation from protective father figure to apparent enemy, requiring acting skills that left both of them scarred by the performance. The man who had once bandaged her scraped knees and lectured her about staying away from dangerous tide pools was now forced to treat her as the greatest threat their community had ever faced. His every gesture calculated to reinforce the fiction that their relationship had been permanently severed by her apparent betrayal. But beneath the surface of public rejection, subtle signs indicated that the truth of her situation was understood and appreciated by those who mattered most. Nojiko's tears were real, but they carried grief for circumstances rather than condemnation of choices. Her blue eyes, reflecting understanding that went far deeper than the harsh words she was forced to speak for the benefit of any watchers who might be evaluating the authenticity of their family's dissolution. The plan that the village elders had developed during her absence was ambitious in its scope and desperate in its implications. Their decision to mount a direct assault on Arlong Park, representing the accumulated frustration of people who had endured oppression long enough to prefer death to continued submission. The weapons they had gathered were crude but serviceable. The tactics they had planned were simple but potentially effective, and their determination was absolute despite their recognition that success would likely cost many lives. Nami's discovery of their preparations filled her with horror that went beyond concern for their physical safety to encompass understanding of how completely her careful sacrifices would be rendered meaningless if they proceeded with their suicidal plan. 8 years of servitude, 8 years of carefully maintained deception, 8 years of accumulating the ransom that would purchase their freedom without bloodshed. All of it would be destroyed in a single afternoon of violence that could only end in massacre. Her desperate attempts to dissuade them from their course revealed the depths of frustration that had been building within the community, emotions that had been carefully suppressed but never eliminated during the long years of occupation. The men who had once been fishermen and farmers and craftsmen had been transformed by circumstance into warriors driven by rage that could no longer be contained by rational calculation of odds or consequences. The revelation of her hidden treasure should have provided the evidence they needed to understand that liberation was possible through patient accumulation rather than desperate violence. But the 93 million berries she had painstakingly gathered represented both hope and bitter reminder of how close they had come to achieving their goal through peaceful means. 7 million berries, such a small amount compared to what she had already sacrificed. Yet it might as well have been 7 billion for all the likelihood that she could obtain it before their patience finally expired completely. The betrayal that destroyed those hopes arrived in the familiar form of corruption. Nezumi's casual theft of her life's work, representing everything that was wrong with a world where justice served only those powerful enough to purchase it. The Marine captain, who should have been protecting innocent civilians from exploitation, had instead become another predator feeding on their desperation, his uniform serving as camouflage for appetites that were indistinguishable from those of the pirates he supposedly opposed. The moment when her carefully counted savings disappeared into Nezumi's greedy hands marked the death of the last illusion she had maintained about the possibility of achieving freedom through adherence to rules established by those who had no intention of honoring them. The system she had trusted to provide eventual justice had revealed itself as merely another form of predation, its legal authority making it more dangerous than simple piracy because it carried the pretense of legitimacy. Arlong's casual dismissal of their agreement revealed the sophisticated cruelty that had always lurked beneath his willingness to negotiate, his understanding of human psychology, allowing him to extract maximum suffering from the destruction of hope that had been carefully nurtured over years of patient effort. The fishman's laughter as he explained that their deal had never been legally binding carried implications that went far beyond immediate circumstances to encompass the fundamental impossibility of achieving justice through cooperation with those who viewed mercy as weakness, to be exploited. The suggestion that she could simply start again from zero demonstrated his complete understanding of the psychological torture he was inflicting. His offer to maintain their arrangement while resetting the financial requirements representing cruelty refined to an art form. He knew that she would endure even this additional humiliation if it meant preserving hope for eventual liberation, just as he knew that the village would not possess sufficient patience to wait another 8 years for results that might never materialize. The breaking point that followed was as inevitable as sunrise, the accumulated pressure of years of suppressed emotion finally exceeding her capacity for rational self-control. The blade that she turned against her own flesh was wielded with the same desperate precision that had characterized all her efforts to escape the trap that circumstances had constructed around her, each cut an attempt to excise the symbols of slavery that had marked her as property rather than person. The Arlong pirate's tattoo that she tried to destroy with her own hands had been more than mere identification. It was a brand that declared to everyone who saw it that she belonged to forces that had demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who interfered with their operations. But it was also a shield that had protected those she loved by making her appear complicit in their oppression, a necessary deception that had cost her more than anyone could understand. The blood that flowed from her self-inflicted wounds carried away more than just physical pain. It represented the dissolution of barriers she had maintained between hope and despair, the breakdown of psychological defenses that had allowed her to function despite circumstances that should have destroyed her spirit years earlier. Each drop that stained the ground was a tear she had refused to shed, a scream she had never been allowed to voice, a moment of human weakness that she had never been permitted to acknowledge. Luffy's intervention transformed what might have been mere self-destruction into the first genuine choice she had been allowed to make in nearly a decade, his simple presence providing alternative to the false dilemma that had trapped her between betraying her family and watching them die. The straw hat he placed upon her head carried weight that went far beyond its modest physical substance, representing trust freely offered without conditions or expectations of reciprocal service. The words that finally escaped her lips, "Help me," were perhaps the most difficult she had ever spoken, each syllable requiring her to abandon years of carefully maintained independence and accept that some burdens were too great for any individual to carry alone. The admission represented complete vulnerability in the presence of someone she had known for mere weeks. Yet somehow, he had earned her trust in ways that years of careful observation had never granted to anyone else. The declaration that followed her plea carried implications that reached far beyond immediate circumstances, to encompass fundamental transformation in how she understood her place in the world. By accepting Luffy's help, she was acknowledging that the isolation she had maintained as protection had become prison, that the strength she had cultivated through self-reliance had reached the limits of what individual will could accomplish against organized oppression. The march toward Arlong Park that began with her desperate request for assistance was unlike anything Kokoyasi village had witnessed since the Fishman pirates had first established their dominion over the East Blue. But this was not the desperate assault that the villagers had planned. Driven by rage and desperation with little hope of success, it was something far more dangerous and infinitely more hopeful, a declaration of war against injustice itself, rather than mere rebellion against specific oppressors. Luffy's calm acceptance of the challenge represented everything that Nami had been seeking without knowing it: strength that was not corrupted by the exercise of power, determination that was not compromised by personal ambition, loyalty that was not conditional upon reciprocal benefit. The boy who dreamed of becoming Pirate King possessed qualities that most people in positions of authority had long since abandoned, if they had ever possessed them at all. Zoro's readiness to follow his captain into battle against odds that should have been daunting spoke to bonds that transcended mere alliance or convenience. The swordsman's willingness to risk his life for someone he barely knew, representing exactly the kind of friendship that Nami had been forced to abandon when circumstances demanded that every relationship be evaluated in terms of tactical advantage rather than emotional satisfaction. Usopp's courage in the face of enemies whose reputation should have sent him fleeing toward the horizon demonstrated growth that went beyond mere skill development to encompass fundamental changes in how he understood his own capabilities and responsibilities. The sniper who had once been paralyzed by his own cowardice was learning that bravery was not the absence of fear, but action taken despite its presence. Sanji's chivalrous determination to protect her from harm represented the kind of unconditional devotion that she had not experienced since Belmer's death. His willingness to place her safety above his own survival, offering glimpses of what it might mean to be valued for who she was, rather than what she could provide. The cook's romantic attentions were often overwhelming, but beneath their theatrical excess lay genuine care that asked for nothing in return. The battle that awaited them at Arlong Park would test every skill they had developed and every bond they had forged, but it would also provide opportunity to prove that some forms of evil could be defeated through the application of sufficient courage and determination. The fortress that had cast its shadow over Kokoyasi village for 8 years was about to discover that its foundations were not as solid as its builders had assumed. Arlong's confidence in his own supremacy was built upon years of unchallenged dominance and the comfortable certainty that humans were inherently inferior in every way that mattered. The fishman's strength was undeniable, his cruelty was legendary, and his control over the East Blue seemed absolute. But all of these advantages were about to be tested by opponents who understood that some principles were worth dying for, and some people were worth saving, regardless of the cost. The revolution that began with a broken girl's desperate plea for help was about to reshape the fundamental balance of power in the East Blue, but more importantly, it was about to prove that families could be chosen rather than inherited, that loyalty could be earned rather than demanded, and that freedom was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it when the right hands were extended in offer of assistance. The navigator who had spent 8 years charting courses toward an impossible goal was finally about to discover what it meant to sail with crewmates who shared her dreams and understood that some destinations were worth any voyage required to reach them, no matter how dangerous the waters or how distant the horizon might appear to those who lacked the courage to begin the journey. The collapse of Arlong Park sent reverberations across the East Blue that extended far beyond the immediate liberation of a single village, its destruction marking the end of an era when might alone could guarantee right, and the beginning of something altogether more complex and hopeful. The fortress that had cast its shadow over Kokoyasi for 8 years crumbled not under the weight of superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but beneath the simple application of principles that refused to accept that strength should be used for oppression rather than protection. Luffy's emergence from the rubble with Arlong's unconscious form draped across his shoulder represented more than victory in combat. It was declaration that the fundamental assumptions governing their world had shifted in ways that would ripple outward. Like stones cast into still water, the boy who had once declared his intention to become Pirate King had proven that such dreams were not mere fantasy, but achievable reality for those who possess sufficient determination and the wisdom to surround themselves with people whose loyalty transcended personal interest. The cry that echoed across the devastated battleground, "Nami is my friend," carried implications that reached far beyond simple proclamation of alliance to encompass redefinition of what friendship could mean when it was founded on choice rather than convenience, understanding rather than utility, love rather than mere tactical advantage. The words themselves were simple, but their impact transformed everything about how the navigator understood her place in a world that had spent years teaching her that survival required solitude and strength, demanded emotional isolation. The tears that streamed down her face as she nodded, acknowledgement of his declaration, were the first honest expressions of joy she had been able to display in public since childhood, each drop carrying away years of accumulated grief and replacing it with something she had almost forgotten was possible. Hope that was not tempered by calculation, gratitude that was not poisoned by suspicion, happiness that existed for its own sake, rather than as camouflage for deeper pain. The marine forces that attempted to restore their corrupted version of order were swept aside with the same casual efficiency that had characterized the battle against Arlong himself, their defeat serving as notice that justice could no longer be purchased through cooperation with those who viewed law enforcement as opportunity for personal enrichment rather than service to abstract ideals. Nezumi's humiliation was complete and public, his exposure as collaborator with the very pirates he was supposed to be hunting marking the beginning of accountability that had been absent from the East Blue for far too long. The celebration that erupted throughout Kokoyashi village was unlike anything its residents had experienced since before Arlong's arrival, their joy unrestrained by the caution that had governed their behavior for nearly a decade. Children who had grown up under occupation laughed without fear of attracting unwanted attention. Adults who had whispered in shadows for years raised their voices in songs that spoke of hope restored and futures reclaimed. Elderly villagers who had despaired of ever seeing freedom again danced with energy that defied their accumulated years. Yet even as the community embraced liberation with enthusiasm that bordered on delirium, Nami found herself confronting realities that victory had created rather than resolved. The tattoo that marked her shoulder as property of the Arlong pirates remained despite her desperate attempts to remove it through violence, its persistence serving as reminder that some wounds could not be healed through simple applications of force or will. Dr. Nako's examination of the damage she had inflicted upon herself revealed the physical limitations of what medical skill could accomplish when confronted with injuries that carried psychological as well as bodily implications. The scars that would remain were not mere disfigurement, but evidence of the prices that freedom sometimes demanded from those brave enough to claim it, permanent reminders of the darkness that had to be endured before light could be allowed to return. The decision to cover the old tattoo with new design represented more than cosmetic choice. It was conscious act of transformation that acknowledged the past while asserting control over how that history would be integrated into whatever future she chose to create. The tangerine and pinwheel that Dr. Nako carefully inscribed over the remnants of Arlong's brand carried meaning that reached far deeper than mere decoration. Each element chosen to honor relationships that had shaped her understanding of what love could accomplish when it was properly applied. The tangerine represented Belmer's legacy in its most tangible form, the fruit that had sustained their small family through lean years while symbolizing the abundance that careful tending could create from humble beginnings. The pinwheel honored Genzo's protective devotion, his willingness to play the role of enemy when friendship would have been dangerous, his understanding that sometimes love required actions that appeared to contradict its very nature. The evening she spent alone in the house where her childhood had ended was both pilgrimage and exorcism. Her return to spaces that held memories too precious to abandon, yet too painful to embrace without careful preparation. The kitchen where Belmer had taught her to cook simple meals carried echoes of laughter that had been silenced by violence, while the bedroom she had shared with Nojiko whispered of secrets shared and dreams confessed in the darkness that preceded sleep. The conversation she held with Belmer's spirit was conducted in words she had never been able to speak while her adoptive mother lived, apologies for cruelty born from childish ignorance, mixed with gratitude for sacrifices that had only been fully understood through her own experience of choosing others' welfare above personal safety. The regret that filled her voice carried weight that went beyond mere acknowledgement of past mistakes to encompass recognition of opportunities for reconciliation that had been lost forever when Arlong's bullet had ended the possibility of making amends through direct communication. But Belmer's response came not through words but through sensation, the feeling of invisible hands upon her shoulders, gentle pressure that conveyed forgiveness that had never been withheld, and approval that had never been conditional upon perfect behavior or flawless judgment. The push that eventually guided her toward the door was encouragement rather than rejection, blessing rather than dismissal, permission to embrace the future rather than commands to remain trapped by the past. The revelation that her foster mother's spirit had been genuinely present during their final conversation provided closure that no amount of rational analysis could have supplied, confirmation that love truly could transcend the boundaries between life and death when it was sufficiently pure and properly directed. The smile that transformed her features as understanding dawned carried lightness that had been absent from her expression for years, joy that emerged from recognition that she was not as alone as circumstances had led her to believe. The treasure she left in Nojiko's care represented more than generous contribution to Kokoyasi's rebuilding efforts. It was conscious choice to prioritize community welfare above personal accumulation, the first decision she had been able to make in years that was not constrained by the mathematics of survival or the requirements of deception. The berries that would repair houses and restore boats and replant gardens destroyed by occupation were worth far more than their monetary value could measure. The theft that marked her departure from Kokoyasi was conducted with theatrical flair that served multiple purposes simultaneously, her appropriation of every wallet in sight, providing one final performance of the role she was abandoning, while generating resources that could support whatever adventures lay ahead. The villagers' mixed reactions, ranging from Sanji's delighted approval to Zoro's cynical prediction of future betrayals, reflected their incomplete understanding of the complex motivations that governed her behavior. But Luffy's laughter in response to her parting gesture demonstrated perception that went deeper than surface appearances, to recognize the joy that motivated actions others might interpret as simple greed or ingrained dishonesty. The captain who had declared her his friend possessed intuitive understanding of human nature that allowed him to see through performances to the authentic emotions they were designed to conceal. His acceptance of her complexity, representing exactly the kind of non-judgmental companionship that her wounded heart required. The journey to Logtown provided opportunity for adjustment to circumstances that felt almost impossibly strange after years of isolation and deception. The simple luxury of traveling with companions whose loyalty was not conditional upon careful management of their perceptions, requiring psychological adaptations that proved more challenging than any physical hardship. Learning to trust required skills that she had deliberately suppressed, while accepting trust demanded vulnerability that felt dangerous despite rational recognition that her new crewmates had already proven their worthiness through actions rather than words. The town where the previous Pirate King had begun and ended his legendary journey carried atmosphere that was both inspiring and sobering, its streets filled with reminders that even the greatest dreams were ultimately subject to the same mortality that claimed ordinary lives. Roger's execution platform stood as monument to the prices that freedom could demand from those who pursued it too boldly, yet it also served as proof that individual sacrifice could inspire changes that outlasted the lives of those who initiated them. Luffy's pilgrimage to the site of Roger's death revealed depths of ambition that went far beyond simple desire for adventure or treasure. His reverence for the man who had preceded him along the path toward ultimate freedom, demonstrating understanding that becoming Pirate King was about more than achieving personal glory. The responsibilities that came with such recognition were heavy enough to crush spirits less resilient than his own. Yet he approached them with the same casual confidence that characterized his response to every other challenge. The battle that erupted when Buggy attempted to execute Luffy on the same platform where his predecessor had died served as preview of the opposition they could expect to face, from enemies whose hatred for what Roger represented had been transferred to anyone who dared to claim his legacy. The lightning bolt that shattered the execution device and preserved Luffy's life might have been dismissed as meteorological coincidence, but those who understood the deeper currents that moved through their world recognized it as evidence that some destinies possessed protection that transcended merely human agency. The escape from Logtown that followed demonstrated how much their small crew had grown in terms of coordination and mutual support, each member's unique abilities contributing to their collective survival in ways that created capabilities exceeding the sum of their individual strengths. Nami's navigation skills ensured that they could find their way through storms that would have scattered less experienced crews, while her growing mastery of meteorological prediction allowed her to use weather as ally rather than simply enduring it as obstacle. The approach to Reverse Mountain marked their transition from the familiar waters of the East Blue to the legendary dangers of the Grand Line, but it also represented Nami's evolution from passenger seeking temporary alliance to crew member committed to shared destinies. The log pose that Crocus provided was more than navigational instrument. It was key to adventures that would test every skill she had developed and every bond she had forged, while offering opportunities for growth that exceeded anything her isolated efforts could have achieved. The whale whose song greeted their arrival at the entrance to the Grand Line served as reminder that the ocean held wonders that transcended human understanding, creatures whose lives operated on scales that made even the longest human journey seem brief by comparison. Laboon's devotion to friends who had vanished into legend 50 years earlier demonstrated that loyalty could survive any test when it was properly founded. His patient vigil offering lessons about the power of hope to sustain life even in circumstances that rational analysis would declare hopeless. The promise that Luffy made to the ancient whale, that they would return to continue their friendship after completing their own journey around the world, represented exactly the kind of commitment that Nami was learning to make without the careful calculations that had once governed every relationship. The boy who had declared her his friend possessed understanding of what such declarations truly meant. His willingness to accept responsibilities that might span decades demonstrating maturity that his casual demeanor often concealed. The maps she began creating as they sailed deeper into Grand Line waters were fundamentally different from anything she had produced during her years of servitude, their purpose shifting from mere documentation of geographical features to artistic expressions of wonder at discoveries that expanded her understanding of what was possible in a world far stranger and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. Each chart became collaboration between scientific observation and creative interpretation. Technical accuracy enhanced by aesthetic considerations that transformed functional documents into works of art. The crew that surrounded her was evolving with equal rapidity, their individual dreams beginning to mesh into collective vision that was greater than any single ambition could encompass. Zoro's pursuit of swordsmanship excellence provided security that allowed others to take risks they might not have dared alone, while Usopp's creative approaches to seemingly impossible problems demonstrated that courage could be found in unexpected places when circumstances demanded heroism from unlikely sources. Sanji's devotion to ensuring that everyone was properly fed represented understanding that adventure was impossible without attention to basic necessities, his culinary skills serving as foundation for everything else they hoped to accomplish. The cook's romantic interests might be theatrical in their expression, but his underlying commitment to nurturing others provided stability that allowed more dramatic personalities to flourish without endangering the group's cohesion. The addition of Tony Chopper to their crew brought medical expertise that would prove essential in waters where dangers could not always be avoided through superior navigation or tactical superiority. But more importantly, it demonstrated their captain's ability to recognize worth in forms that others might dismiss or fear. The reindeer doctor's tragic history resonated with Nami's own experiences of rejection and misunderstanding, creating bonds that went beyond mere professional cooperation to encompass genuine friendship. The adventures that followed their departure from Drum Island revealed the Grand Line's capacity for presenting challenges that tested not just their individual abilities, but their collective commitment to principles that could not be compromised without losing everything that made their journey worthwhile. Each island they visited, each enemy they faced, each ally they gained contributed to the growing legend that surrounded their small crew, while providing opportunities for personal growth that transformed them from promising rookies into genuine threats to the established order. But perhaps most importantly for Nami, these experiences provided evidence that the family she had thought lost forever when Belle-Mère died could be replaced by relationships that were equally profound, despite being founded on choice rather than biology or circumstance. The bonds that connected her to her crewmates were growing stronger with each shared trial. Their trust in her judgment matched by her growing confidence in their loyalty, their acceptance of her complexity, providing the emotional security she had not known she was missing. The navigator who had once charted courses in isolation while carrying burdens too heavy for any individual to bear, was learning what it meant to sail with companions who shared her dreams and understood that some destinations were worth any sacrifice required to reach them. The world she was mapping was revealing new possibilities with each league they traveled, horizons that stretched beyond mere geography to encompass transformations of spirit that could only be achieved through the kind of genuine partnership she had almost convinced herself was impossible. The tangerine trees growing in pots aboard their ship bore fruit that carried the sweetness of memories from happier times, while nourishing adventures that Belle-Mère could never have imagined but would certainly have approved. Each orange that ripened under the care of her new family represented promises kept and debts honored, love that transcended death continuing to sustain life in forms that its original giver might not have anticipated, but would recognize as worthy expressions of the seeds she had planted in two orphaned hearts so many years earlier. The island of Jaya rose from the Grand Line's treacherous waters like a fragment of ancient history preserved against the erosion of time, its shores bearing witness to stories that had begun 400 years earlier, when truth and lies had become so entangled that separating one from the other required wisdom that few possessed. The descendants of Mont Blanc Nolan's expedition lived in the shadow of their ancestors' reputation, branded as heirs to dishonor that they had neither earned nor deserved, yet carried with the resignation of those who understood that some injustices transcend individual lifetimes. Cricket's obsession with recovering artifacts from the legendary City of Gold represented more than mere treasure hunting. It was a desperate attempt to restore family honor that had been trampled beneath centuries of ridicule and contempt. The man who spent his days diving into waters that had claimed countless other seekers possessed determination that went beyond rational hope to encompass faith that truth would eventually surface, regardless of how deeply it had been, buried beneath layers of skepticism and scorn. His knowledge of the knock-up stream that could carry ships to the Sky Islands, floating 10,000 meters above the ocean's surface, was born from years of careful observation and scientific study, understanding earned through patient accumulation of data that others dismissed as impossible fantasy. The phenomenon that occurred with predictable regularity in specific locations represented opportunity for those brave enough to risk everything on theories that conventional wisdom declared absurd. The preparation of the Going Merry for vertical flight required modifications that transformed their beloved ship into something that resembled the fevered imaginings of engineers whose understanding of physics had been corrupted by excessive exposure to Grand Line impossibilities. Masira and Shoju's contributions to the retrofit process demonstrated expertise that had been developed through decades of salvage work in waters where normal rules did not apply. Their mechanical innovations, creating capabilities that existed nowhere else in recorded maritime history. The alliance between the Saruyama Alliance and the Straw Hat Pirates was founded on shared recognition that some dreams were worth pursuing despite overwhelming odds against success, their cooperation representing exactly the kind of mutual support that allowed impossible objectives to become merely improbable ones. The monkeys, whose lives had been dedicated to recovering fragments of civilizations lost to time, understood better than most that adventure required partnerships between those whose individual abilities complemented each other perfectly. Nami's role in their skybound expedition extended far beyond simple navigation to encompass meteorological analysis that could mean the difference between successful launch and catastrophic failure. Her understanding of weather patterns and atmospheric pressure, proving essential for timing their attempt to coincide with conditions that would maximize their chances of survival. The calculations required for predicting the knock-up stream's optimal performance demanded mathematical skills that had been honed through years of creating charts whose accuracy was measured in lives saved or lost. The launch itself was an exercise in controlled chaos that tested every assumption about what ships could endure when subjected to forces that naval architects had never been required to consider. The Going Merry's hull groaning under stresses that should have torn her apart, while her crew clung to whatever solid surfaces they could find, as their world rotated through angles that violated every expectation about how travel should occur. The ascent through layers of atmosphere that grew progressively thinner as they climbed toward heights where human lungs struggled to extract sufficient oxygen from air that felt more like memory of breathing than the substantial reality they required for survival was accompanied by views that no earthbound observer could ever witness. The east blue spread beneath them like a map made real, its islands reduced to decorative elements in a composition whose scope challenged their ability to process visual information that exceeded normal human experience. Their arrival at the White Sea marked transition into a realm where physics operated according to principles that seemed to mock everything they thought they understood about natural law. the cloud-based ocean supporting their ship's weight, while providing navigation challenges that no conventional training had prepared Nami to address. The density variations within seemingly uniform cloud formations created currents and obstacles that required constant vigilance to avoid, while the reduced atmospheric pressure affected both their physical performance and their equipment's reliability. Skypiea itself exceeded every dream of wonder that any of them had ever entertained. Its cloud-based cities, representing architectural achievements that defied gravity, while demonstrating artistic sensibilities that transformed functional structures into expressions of beauty that seemed to glow with internal light. The Shandian civilization that had been lifted from the earth 4 centuries earlier had adapted to their aerial environment while maintaining cultural traditions that connected them to origins they could never reclaim. The conflict between the Skypieans and the Shandians represented tragedy that had consumed generations of both peoples, their war born from misunderstandings that had been allowed to fester until positions had hardened into dogma that admitted no possibility of compromise or reconciliation. The golden bell that Noland had promised Cricket's ancestor he would ring again had become symbol of promises that seemed destined to remain forever unfulfilled, its silence serving as monument to the costs of pride and the limitations of individual perspective. Enel's tyrannical rule over the Sky Islands was founded upon devil fruit powers that made him seem godlike to populations whose technology could not compete with his mastery over lightning, his ability to monitor conversations, and deliver instant punishment from any distance, creating surveillance state where dissent was impossible and resistance was literally suicidal. The former priest, who had proclaimed himself divine, possessed psychological profile that combined megalomania with genuine belief in his own superiority, making him dangerous in ways that went beyond mere physical capabilities. The survival game that he initiated as entertainment was designed to demonstrate his omnipotence, while providing amusement that satisfied sadistic impulses refined through years of unchallenged dominance. Its rules structured to ensure maximum psychological trauma for participants while guaranteeing that their suffering would be prolonged rather than quickly ended. The arbitrary nature of who would be eliminated and when was calculated to prevent any possibility of rational strategy while ensuring that hope would be repeatedly raised and crushed. Nami's participation in Enel's twisted entertainment represented her first real test as crew member rather than temporary ally. Her refusal to abandon her friends, despite opportunities to secure her own safety, demonstrating growth that went beyond mere tactical evolution to encompass fundamental transformation in how she understood her responsibilities to others. The woman who had once prioritized survival above all other considerations was learning that some things were worth dying for when preserving them required ultimate sacrifice. The Upper Yard's revelation as portion of Jaya that had been launched skyward 4 centuries earlier provided resolution to mysteries that had haunted both civilizations for generations, proving that neither Cricket's ancestor nor the Shandians had been lying about the existence of the Golden City. The truth that had been dismissed as fantasy by those who lacked imagination to accept possibilities beyond their limited experience was finally revealed in forms that even the most skeptical observers could not deny. The Golden Bell, whose song had once called ships safely to harbor, became voice that could finally tell the story that had been silenced by tragedy and misunderstanding, its resonant tones carrying across distances that measured more than mere physical space to bridge gaps between past and present, truth and legend, promise and fulfillment. When its music finally rang across the clouds, it spoke of friendships that had survived death, and dreams that had outlasted the civilizations that had given them birth. Luffy's battle with Enel represented clash between fundamentally different approaches to strength and leadership the self-proclaimed god's reliance on overwhelming power meeting resistance from someone whose rubber body rendered lightning attacks ineffective, while his character made him immune to intimidation or despair. The fight that followed was as much philosophical debate as physical combat, each exchange testing whether tyranny could be defeated by determination when conventional weapons proved inadequate. The victory that followed Enel's defeat was celebrated not just by the Straw Hat pirates, but by populations who had lived under oppression for so long that freedom seemed like concept from fairy tales rather than achievable reality. The liberation of Skypiea represented proof that even the most entrenched systems of control could be overthrown when enough people possessed courage to stand together against injustice, regardless of how godlike their oppressors appeared to be. The treasure they received as reward for ending the 400-year war was valuable beyond its monetary worth, the gold they were given representing recognition from grateful civilizations whose survival had depended upon their willingness to intervene in conflicts that were not originally their responsibility. But more importantly, the experience had provided evidence that their small crew could achieve objectives that seemed impossible when evaluated by conventional standards. The maps that Nami created of their Sky Island adventures were unlike anything in her previous portfolio. Their documentation of cloud-based geography and atmospheric navigation techniques representing pioneering work in fields that had never before been systematically studied. The charts she produced would serve as foundation for future expeditions to realms that most people assumed were purely mythological, opening possibilities for exploration that exceeded anything previous generations of navigators had imagined. The Davy-back fight that followed their return to the ocean's surface provided their first encounter with pirates whose approach to competition was founded on rules rather than simple violence. The Foxy Pirates' adherence to ancient traditions, demonstrating that even criminals could maintain honor codes when properly motivated. The games themselves were designed to test skills that went beyond mere combat ability to encompass teamwork, strategy, and the kind of creative problem-solving that characterized the most successful crews. Nami's participation in the boat race revealed how much her understanding of navigation had evolved since joining the Straw Hats. Her ability to guide their makeshift vessel through obstacle courses that would have challenged experienced racers, demonstrating mastery that went beyond technical knowledge to encompass intuitive understanding of how water moved and how boats responded to subtle changes in current and wind. The victory they achieved was founded on her contributions as much as her teammates' physical abilities. The encounter with Admiral Aokiji that concluded their long-ring Longland adventures provided sobering reminder of the forces that would oppose them as their reputation grew and their activities attracted attention from Marine headquarters. The ice-powered Admiral's casual demonstration of overwhelming strength, serving as preview of opposition they could expect to face when their journey carried them into waters where serious criminals were actively hunted. Robin's freezing at Aokiji's hands was both warning and demonstration, evidence that even crew members with devil fruit abilities that seemed invincible could be neutralized by opponents who possessed superior mastery of their own powers, combined with tactical intelligence that had been refined through decades of combat experience. The lesson about vulnerability was delivered with surgical precision, designed to educate rather than destroy, but clear in its implications about what awaited those who continued to challenge established authority. The thawing process that restored Robin to full health required teamwork that drew upon every crew member's unique abilities, their coordination in addressing the crisis, demonstrating how much they had grown as functioning unit rather than collection of individuals who happened to share transportation. The bonds that had been forged through shared adventure proved strong enough to overcome challenges that might have defeated groups whose relationships were founded on convenience rather than genuine affection. Water 7's approach on their horizon carried promise of ship repair and supply replenishment, but it also marked beginning of trials that would test their crew's cohesion in ways that external enemies had never managed to achieve. The city of shipwrights and sea trains represented civilization at its most sophisticated, their mastery of maritime technology creating wonders that made even Grand Line impossibilities seem mundane by comparison. The Going Merry's diagnosis as beyond salvation was delivered with professional compassion by craftsmen who understood that ships became more than mere transportation when they carried crews through adventures that forged them into families, yet whose expertise could not be compromised by sentiment. When structural integrity was measured in lives that could be lost if repairs were inadequate, the keel damage that made her unseaworthy represented injuries that no amount of skill or care could heal. Entropy, finally claiming victim from forces that had been postponed but never defeated. The conflict with CP9 that emerged from what should have been routine maintenance visit revealed depths of government conspiracy that extended far beyond simple law enforcement into systematic infiltration designed to acquire weapons that could reshape the balance of power throughout the world. The agents who had spent years establishing false identities within Water 7's shipbuilding community possessed skills that made them dangerous opponents, while their government backing made them nearly untouchable through conventional means. Robin's apparent betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have managed. Her calm announcement that she was leaving them forever, transforming the woman they had trusted completely into stranger, whose motivations seemed incomprehensible, and whose loyalty had apparently been mere performance designed to serve purposes they had never suspected. The revelation that their archaeologist had been using them from the beginning called into question every assumption they had made about reading people's characters and understanding their true intentions. But the truth behind her actions, when it finally emerged, revealed nobility that shamed their initial suspicions, while demonstrating the lengths to which she would go to protect people who had shown her acceptance she had never expected to find. Her willingness to sacrifice herself to prevent Eni's lobby from calling a buster call against Water 7 was motivated by exactly the kind of love that had characterized every meaningful relationship in Nami's own life. Recognition that some people were worth saving regardless of personal cost. The declaration of war against the world government that followed their understanding of Robin's true situation represented escalation in their conflict with established authority that could never be reversed or forgotten. Their attack on Eni's lobby, serving notice that they had evolved from minor criminals into genuine threats to stability that had been maintained through fear rather than justice. The burning of the world government flag was a symbolic act that carried practical implications extending far beyond mere gesture of defiance. The battles that followed tested every skill they had developed while revealing reserves of strength and determination that they had not known they possessed. Each crew member rising to meet challenges that should have been beyond their capabilities while demonstrating growth that transformed them from promising rookies into forces that even veteran agents were compelled to respect. The victories they achieved were founded not just on individual prowess, but on teamwork that had been refined through shared adversity. Nami's confrontation with Khalifa revealed how much she had grown since her early days of relying primarily on deception and theft to overcome opponents. Her mastery of weather-based combat techniques allowing her to defeat enemies whose physical abilities exceeded her own through application of strategy and environmental manipulation. The perfect climate act that Usopp had created for her was a weapon that amplified her natural understanding of meteorological forces while providing tools that could create tactical advantages in almost any circumstances. The rescue of Robin from Eni's lobby's Tower of Justice represented triumph that went beyond mere tactical success to encompass validation of principles that had guided their actions since the beginning of their journey together. Their refusal to abandon crew member, demonstrating commitment to family bonds that transcended convenience, or rational calculation. The woman who had believed herself cursed to destroy everyone who cared for her discovered that some relationships were strong enough to survive any test when they were properly founded. The Going Merry's final voyage to rescue them from Eni's lobby provided closure that transformed grief into celebration, her spirit's manifestation allowing proper farewell that honored years of faithful service, while acknowledging that even the most beloved vessels eventually reach limits that love could not transcend. The funeral that followed was conducted with ceremonies appropriate for crew member rather than mere transportation, recognition that she had earned place in their hearts that death could not diminish. The thousand sunny that replaced her was gift that honored the past while embracing future possibilities. Frankie's craftsmanship creating capabilities that exceeded anything they had previously imagined, while maintaining aesthetic sensibilities that would make their new ship home rather than mere conveyance. The cyborg's addition to their crew brought engineering expertise that would prove essential for adventures that lay ahead. His flamboyant personality, adding energy that complemented their existing dynamics perfectly. As they sailed away from Water 7 toward horizons that held promise of adventures that would test everything they had learned about courage, loyalty, and the power of dreams to overcome impossible odds, Nami could reflect on transformations that had carried her far beyond anything she might have imagined when she first set sail with a rubber boy, whose optimism seemed too naive for the harsh realities that governed their world. The navigator, who had once charted courses in isolation, was learning what it meant to sail with family toward destinations that could only be reached through shared determination and mutual trust. The Sabaody archipelago emerged from the horizon like a fever dream given architectural form, its massive mangrove trees rising from the ocean floor, with trunks so colossal that entire cities had been constructed upon their roots without diminishing their capacity to sustain the bubble-producing resin that gave the island its patient, distinctive character. The coating process that would allow ships to dive beneath the red line represented technology that bordered on miraculous, yet it was administered with the casual efficiency of craftsmen who had long since ceased to marvel at wonders that visitors found impossible to comprehend. The presence of the other supernovas throughout the archipelago's various groves created an atmosphere of barely contained violence that even civilians could sense. 11 rookie pirates, whose bounties exceeded 100 million berries each, representing concentration of ambition and danger that had not been witnessed in these waters for generations. Each crew possessed its own distinctive approach to the pursuit of impossible dreams, yet all were united by recognition that they stood at the threshold of waters where failure meant not just death but complete erasure from history's pages. Trafalgar Law's submarine presence near the mangrove coating facilities spoke to strategic thinking that went beyond mere preparation for the New World's challenges. His crew's disciplined movements and coordinated responses, suggesting military precision that had been refined through encounters with opposition that demanded nothing less than perfection to survive. The surgeon's reputation preceded him across every grove. Whispers of his medical expertise intertwined with accounts of surgical precision, applied to combat situations where mercy was luxury that few could afford. Eustace Kidd's magnetic manipulation had already left its mark throughout the commercial districts, twisted metal sculptures serving as warnings about the consequences of interfering with someone whose temper was legendary, even among pirates known for their volatility. His willingness to inflict violence for perceived slights created trail of destruction that forced other visitors to modify their own plans to avoid inadvertent confrontation with someone whose definition of acceptable provocation remained frustratingly unpredictable. The human auction house represented everything that was fundamentally wrong with a world that had organized itself around the systematic exploitation of those too weak to resist. Slavery disguised as legitimate commerce, while suffering was packaged as entertainment for audiences wealthy enough to afford such diversions. The casual cruelty of the bidding process reduced human beings to commodities valued solely for their potential utility, creating an atmosphere of institutionalized evil that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable with its implications. Kami's appearance on the auction block transformed what should have been routine reconnaissance into moral crisis that demanded immediate action regardless of tactical considerations or strategic consequences, her tears serving as indictment of every system that allowed such atrocities to occur under the protection of legal authority. The sight of a friend reduced to property awaiting purchase by strangers who would never see her as anything more than expensive toy triggered every protective instinct that Belmere had taught Nami to honor above personal safety. St. Charles embodied everything that was corrupt about inherited privilege when it was not tempered by wisdom or restrained by conscience. His casual cruelty toward those he considered beneath notice, revealing depths of moral bankruptcy that absolute power could create in those who had never faced consequences for their actions. His decision to shoot Hachan for the crime of existing in his presence was not aberrant behavior, but standard operating procedure for someone who had never learned that other people possessed worth independent of their utility to him. Luffy's punch that connected with the world noble's face echoed throughout the auction house like thunderclap, the sound carrying implications that extended far beyond immediate satisfaction of seeing justice applied to someone who had spent his entire life evading it. This was not just violence against an individual, but rebellion against everything that individual represented, declaration that some actions were so fundamentally wrong that they demanded response regardless of whatever consequences such response might bring upon those who delivered it. The aftermath of that single blow created ripples that spread across the entire world like stones cast into still water. Admiral Kizaru's deployment to Sabaudi, representing the world government's recognition that what had occurred could not be dismissed as mere pirate misbehavior, but constituted genuine threat to the system of inherited privilege that kept the current order stable. The assault on a world noble demanded response proportional to the challenge it posed to fundamental assumptions about who possessed the right to use violence and under what circumstances. The battle that erupted between the three supernovas and Kizaru demonstrated both how far they had progressed and how much further they needed to develop before they could challenge the established hierarchy on anything approaching equal terms, their combined efforts barely sufficient to create openings for escape, rather than achieving anything that resembled victory. The Admiral's light-based powers operated on scale that made conventional combat strategies meaningless. His ability to move at speeds that exceeded human perception, transforming every encounter into test of reflexes that nervous systems were not designed to pass. The arrival of Bartholomew Kuma transformed what had been difficult but manageable situation into something approaching apocalypse, the warlord's paw-based abilities creating tactical challenges that went beyond anything they had previously encountered, while his apparent immunity to conventional attacks made retreat the only viable option. His power to repel anything he touched, including abstract concepts like pain and fatigue, made him effectively untouchable, while simultaneously providing offensive capabilities that could end fights before opponents realized they had begun. The systematic separation of the crew represented Luffy's greatest failure as captain, his inability to protect the people who had chosen to follow him into dangers that exceeded their collective ability to handle, creating wounds that would take years to heal. One by one, his crewmates vanished into Kuma's paw bubbles, transported to destinations unknown while he stood helpless to prevent their disappearance, each loss feeling like amputation of limbs that had become essential to his functioning as both pirate and person. Nami's transportation to Weatheria occurred in the space between heartbeats, the sensation of being compressed into bubble of air carrying her across distances that should have required weeks of conventional travel, while her consciousness struggled to process experiences that human minds were not equipped to. interpret. The transition from solid ground to Sky Island happened so quickly that adjustment felt impossible, her body demanding explanations for circumstances that defied every assumption about how movement through space was supposed to occur. The Sky Island that became her temporary home was unlike anything she had encountered during their previous adventures in aerial territories. Witheria's dedication to meteorological research, representing pure science, unmarred by political considerations or commercial applications. The weather wizards who inhabited the floating laboratory had spent generations accumulating knowledge about atmospheric phenomena, their understanding of how air moved, and why clouds formed exceeding anything that conventional education could provide. Herodes became her primary instructor in sciences that she had previously understood only through intuitive observation, his patient explanations transforming instinctive reactions to environmental changes into systematic comprehension of the forces that governed weather patterns throughout the world. The old man's enthusiasm for his subject was infectious, his delight in sharing knowledge with someone capable of appreciating its implications, creating learning environment that made even the most complex concepts seem accessible. The weather balls that served as foundation for Witheria's most advanced research represented technology that could reshape entire climates when properly applied, their ability to store and release atmospheric conditions, creating possibilities that bordered on terraforming. But such power came with responsibilities that the scientists took seriously. Their understanding of interconnected nature of global weather systems, making them cautious about experimenting with forces that could have consequences extending far beyond their immediate intentions. Nami's initial attempts to steal their research were motivated by familiar patterns of thinking that equated survival with accumulation of resources. Her years of conditioning under Arlong's rule, having taught her to view knowledge as commodity to be acquired rather than gift to be received through patient study. The imprisonment that followed her failed theft represented justice rather than cruelty. The scientist's response calibrated to provide education about consequences rather than simple punishment for transgression. The newspaper that brought news of Ace's execution hit her like physical blow. The revelation that Luffy's brother had died while she was safely studying weather patterns 10,000 meters above the conflict, creating guilt that threatened to consume her entirely. The tears that followed were not just grief for loss she had never anticipated, but recognition that she had failed in her primary responsibility as crew member, being present when her captain needed support most desperately. The scientist's decision to release her was motivated by understanding that some pain could not be addressed through confinement, their recognition that her grief was genuine, transforming their perception of her from dangerous intruder into fellow human being, deserving of compassion. The freedom they granted came with no conditions beyond implicit understanding that she would not repeat her earlier mistakes. Trust offered despite evidence that such faith might be misplaced. The escape attempt that followed her release was conducted with theatrical precision, designed to maintain face while accomplishing objectives that served everyone's interests simultaneously. Her apparent hostage-taking of Herodes providing cover for departure that preserved his reputation among colleagues, while allowing her to begin journey toward reunion with whatever remained of her scattered crew. The old weather wizard's cooperation in this deception demonstrated understanding that sometimes helping others required participating in necessary fictions. The message contained in Luffy's return to Marineford provided exactly the guidance she needed to interpret events that had seemed random and chaotic when viewed from distance. The 3D2Y tattoo on his arm spelling out timeline that would allow proper preparation for challenges that awaited them in waters where inadequate strength meant not just failure, but death. The 3 days crossed out and 2 years written in their place represented acknowledgement that some objectives required patience that went against every instinct for immediate action. Her decision to remain on Weatheria for the full duration of their separation was motivated by recognition that individual strength would be meaningless if she could not contribute to collective capabilities that exceeded what any single person could achieve alone. Her understanding that navigation in the new world would require skills that went far beyond reading conventional charts or predicting normal weather patterns. The training that followed would transform her from talented amateur into professional whose expertise could mean difference between success and catastrophe. The 2 years that followed passed like extended meditation on the nature of atmospheric science, each lesson building upon the last, to create comprehensive understanding of how weather functioned as global system rather than collection of isolated phenomena. The knowledge she accumulated went beyond practical applications to encompass theoretical frameworks that allowed prediction of climate patterns extending months or even years into the future, capabilities that would prove invaluable when applied to navigation challenges that conventional methods could not address. The perfect climate act's evolution under Weatheria's influence represented synthesis between technology and understanding that transformed simple weapon into precision instrument, capable of creating localized weather effects. With accuracy that bordered on supernatural, her mastery of its capabilities, allowing her to generate everything from gentle breezes to devastating storms depending upon what circumstances required. The staff that had once produced party tricks now wielded forces that could reshape battlefields according to her will. But perhaps more importantly, the isolation and study provided opportunity for psychological growth that had been impossible while surrounded by crewmates whose needs demanded constant attention and whose loyalty created responsibilities that left little time for introspection. The solitude that had initially felt like punishment gradually became necessity, providing mental space required for processing experiences and integrating lessons that could only be fully understood when examined without distraction. The memories of their adventures together took on new significance when viewed through the lens of separation, each shared triumph and collective victory revealing layers of meaning that had not been apparent when they were occurring. The bonds that had been forged through mutual dependence and shared danger proved strong enough to survive physical distance, their connection transcending immediate proximity to encompass understanding that went deeper than mere convenience or tactical advantage. The letters that arrived sporadically from various crew members provided glimpses into their individual journeys of growth and discovery, each message revealing how much they were changing while confirming that core characteristics remained constant despite whatever trials they might be enduring. Chopper's updates about medical research carried enthusiasm that had not been dimmed by whatever challenges he was facing, while Usopp's accounts of engineering projects demonstrated creativity that was expanding rather than contracting under pressure. The realization that Zoro was training under Mihawk's supervision provided both comfort and concern, relief that he was receiving instruction from the world's greatest swordsman, balanced against worry about what such education might cost someone whose pride had already driven him to sacrifice so much in pursuit of excellence. The rivalry that had defined their relationship since childhood was being tempered by understanding that some goals required accepting help from unexpected sources, growth that would benefit everyone who depended upon his strength. Sanji's experiences, in whatever hell he had been transported to, remained mysterious despite occasional communications, his messages carrying undertones of suffering that he was determined not to burden others with, while providing reassurance that he was becoming stronger in ways that went beyond mere cooking techniques. The chivalry that defined his character was apparently being tested by circumstances that challenged every assumption he had made about proper behavior, education that would reshape his understanding of what it meant to protect those who mattered to him, The weather science that consumed her days provided foundation for capabilities that would prove essential when they finally reunited, but it also offered framework for understanding how individual actions could have consequences that rippled across vast distances when properly applied. The butterfly effect that meteorologists discussed in theoretical terms became practical reality for someone whose job would be guiding their ship through waters where single navigational error could doom everyone who depended upon her judgment. The return to Sabaody that marked the end of their separation carried emotional weight that made simple reunion feel like resurrection, the restoration of family bonds that had been stretched across 2 years of uncertainty and growth, creating joy that exceeded anything she had experienced since Belmer's death. The crew that assembled at the Thousand Sunny bore signs of their individual ordeals, but also evidence of development that had transformed promising rookies into genuine threats to established order. The dive toward Fishman Island that followed their reunion represented more than geographical transition. It was descent into waters where the lessons they had learned in isolation would be tested against challenges that required every skill they had developed while separated. The navigator who had spent 2 years mastering weather science was finally ready to guide her family toward horizons that held promise of adventures exceeding anything they had previously imagined. Storms that could only be navigated by those who understood that some destinations were worth whatever journey might be required to reach them. The depths of Fishman Island revealed themselves like a jewel lost in oceanic darkness, its bubble-enclosed cities creating an underwater paradise that defied every assumption about what was possible, 10,000 meters beneath the surface, where sunlight had never penetrated and pressure should have crushed any attempt at human habitation. The artificial sun that provided illumination for this submerged kingdom represented triumph of engineering over environmental limitation, proof that determination could create beauty in places where none should have been able to exist according to natural law. The discrimination that had shaped Fishman Island's history provided Nami with her first real exposure to systemic prejudice that went beyond individual cruelty to encompass entire societies built upon assumptions of racial superiority. The segregation between fishmen and humans, having created wounds that festered across generations, while each side nursed grievances that justified further hatred in endless cycles of retribution and resentment. The scars left by centuries of mutual antagonism were visible everywhere she looked, from the fearful reactions of mermaids who had never seen humans to the aggressive posturing of fishmen, whose strength made them dangerous when motivated by accumulated rage. Jinbei's presence on the island carried weight that extended far beyond his individual strength or reputation as one of the 7 warlords of the sea, his status representing the complex political calculations that had shaped relationships between Fishman Island and the surface world for decades. His decision to meet with Luffy, despite the risks such association might bring to his people, demonstrated commitment to principles that transcended mere political expedience, recognition that some bonds were worth preserving regardless of whatever complications they might create. The revelation of his connection to Arlong struck Nami like lightning from a clear sky. The knowledge that her tormentor had once served under someone she was learning to respect, creating cognitive dissonance that challenged every assumption she had made about the nature of good and evil. The fishman, whose nobility had impressed her from their first meeting, was forced to accept responsibility for horrors that had shaped her entire adolescence, his willingness to face her judgment, demonstrating exactly the kind of courage that Arlong had never possessed. But rather than demanding vengeance for years of suffering that could be traced directly to his failure to control his subordinates' actions, Nami found herself offering forgiveness that surprised even her with its completeness, her understanding that hatred only perpetuated cycles of violence that had already claimed too many victims. The grace she extended to someone who had every reason to expect condemnation spoke to growth that went beyond mere emotional maturity to encompass wisdom about the true costs of carrying grudges across years that could be better spent building something positive. Hody Jones represented everything toxic about racial pride when it curdled into supremacist ideology. His leadership of the new Fishman pirates reflecting hatred so pure that it had consumed every other aspect of his identity until nothing remained except the desire to inflict upon others the pain that he imagined his people had. Sufat, his abuse of energy steroids served as metaphor for the way that anger could provide temporary strength while ultimately destroying those who relied upon it as their primary source of power. Each pill he consumed trading future health for immediate capability. The battle for Fishman Island's soul played out not just on physical battlefields, but in the hearts of citizens who had to choose between the easy comfort of familiar prejudices and the difficult work of building bridges across pates, divisions that had defined their society for centuries. Princess Shirahoshi's courage in facing those who sought her death demonstrated the kind of moral leadership that could inspire transformation, even in circumstances where hatred seemed too entrenched to be overcome through anything short of overwhelming force. Luffy's defeat of Hody Jones was notable not for its difficulty, but for its ease, the growth that 2 years of training had produced, making Fishman's strength insufficient to provide meaningful challenge to someone who had mastered advanced applications of Haki. The victory served as measurement of development that could be quantified through direct comparison, proof that their separation had created capabilities that dwarfed their previous limitations while providing foundation for challenges that lay ahead. The revelation that Shirahoshi was one of the ancient weapons carried implications that stretched far beyond Fishman Island's immediate concerns. Her power to command sea kings representing force that could reshape entire oceans if properly directed. Her innocence and gentleness provided stark contrast to the destructive potential she embodied, raising questions about whether such power could ever be wielded without corruption, while demonstrating that strength did not automatically create cruelty in those who possessed wisdom to use it responsibly. The journey to Punk Hazard began with mysteries that multiplied rather than resolved. As they approached the island split between fire and ice, in defiance of natural law, its very existence suggesting experiments that had gone beyond scientific curiosity to embrace wholesale manipulation of environmental systems. The laboratory that crowned its frozen peaks served as monument to the kinds of horrors that could result when brilliant minds operated without moral constraints, their research priorities determined by curiosity, rather than consideration for consequences that might affect innocent populations. Caesar Clown's experiments on children represented evil that was particularly repugnant to someone whose own childhood had been shaped by adults who, however harsh their methods might have seemed, had ultimately acted in her best interests, rather than pursuing knowledge that required systematic torture of the vulnerable. The sight of children suffering withdrawal from drugs administered under the guise of medical treatment triggered protective instincts that had been honed through years of defending those who could not defend themselves against exploitation by stronger forces. The alliance with Trafalgar Law marked the first time Luffy had agreed to subordinate his immediate impulses to longer-term strategic planning. The surgeon's proposal to target one of the 4 emperors, requiring patience and coordination that had once been foreign to his nature. The plan that emerged combined Law's calculating intelligence with Luffy's innovative approach to problem-solving in ways that created possibilities that neither could have achieved alone, their cooperation demonstrating evolution in tactical thinking that would prove essential for challenges ahead. The confrontation with Law over the true nature of their alliance revealed depths of psychological damage that had shaped the surgeon's entire approach to relationships. his inability to trust stemming from betrayals that had occurred during formative years when he had been most vulnerable to influence. The revelation that their partnership was built upon deception rather than mutual respect should have destroyed their cooperation, yet somehow only strengthened bonds that were founded on deeper compatibility of purpose than either had initially recognized. Doflamingo's influence over Dressrosa represented corruption that had metastasized throughout an entire kingdom, his string-based powers serving as metaphor for the ways that manipulation could transform citizens into puppets who performed according to scripts they had never consciously chosen to follow. The toys that populated his kingdom were not whimsical decorations, but former humans whose memories had been erased from the minds of those who had once loved them, their transformation representing systematic destruction of relationships that held communities together. The Corrida Colosseum provided Luffy with opportunity to compete for prize that carried emotional weight beyond its practical value. Ace's devil fruit representing not just power, but connection to a brother whose sacrifice continued to motivate every choice he made. The tournament that would determine the fruit's new owner brought together warriors whose strength reflected the elevated standards that prevailed in the new world, each contestant possessing abilities that would have made them legends in weaker seas. Nami's role in the Dressrosa operation required skills that went beyond navigation to encompass tactical analysis and strategic planning. Her responsibility for coordinating multiple groups while maintaining communication between allies, whose success depended upon precise timing and flawless execution. The complexity of managing so many variables simultaneously tested abilities that had been developed through years of juggling competing priorities, her experience in deception and misdirection proving invaluable for operations that required maintaining multiple cover stories. The revelation that the toys throughout Dressrosa were actually transformed humans whose memories had been systematically erased from their loved ones created horror that went beyond physical violence to encompass psychological warfare, designed to destroy the social bonds that made civilization possible. Sugar's devil fruit power represented ultimate expression of totalitarian control, the ability to literally rewrite reality by eliminating inconvenient people from history, while ensuring that no one would remember enough to mourn their disappearance. The battle to liberate Dressrosa required coordination between groups that had never worked together before, their cooperation representing exactly the kind of alliance building that characterized successful revolutions against entrenched power. The gladiators who had been forced to fight for others' entertainment became liberators whose intimate knowledge of the Colosseum's layout provided tactical advantages that external forces could never have achieved, their motivation fueled by years of accumulated grievances against those who had reduced them to mere entertainment. The birdcage that Doflamingo deployed as his final gambit represented desperation disguised as confidence, his willingness to destroy everything he could not control, revealing the psychology of someone who had never learned to accept limitations on his power. The technique that would have killed everyone on the island demonstrated exactly the kind of scorched earth mentality that characterized tyrants who preferred ruling over ashes to accepting that their authority might be successfully challenged. Law's revelation about the true nature of his relationship with Doflamingo added personal dimensions to what had seemed like purely political conflict. The surgeon's quest for revenge, representing justice delayed but not denied. The connection between his tragic past and the heavenly demon's rise to power created narrative symmetry that transformed their confrontation from mere tactical engagement into moral reckoning that had been building for over a tactical engagement decade. The formation of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet occurred despite Luffy's protests rather than because of his planning, 7 crews of powerful pirates voluntarily subordinating themselves to someone whose refusal to accept formal authority only made him more worthy of the loyalty they offered. The sake ceremony that formalized their alliance created bonds that would endure across whatever distances might separate them in years to come. Their commitment representing recognition that some leaders inspired devotion through character, rather than commanding it through fear. The increase in bounties that followed Dressrosa's liberation reflected not just individual accomplishments, but the world's recognition that they had evolved from promising rookies into genuine threats to the established formation, order, someone whose continued existence posed challenges that went beyond mere law enforcement to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of justice and authority. Nami's elevation to 66 million berries marked her transformation from talented navigator to wanted criminal, whose skills made her dangerous to those who profited from maintaining systems that her crew was systematically dismantling. Zhu's revelation as a living creature, rather than conventional island, provided introduction to the Mink tribe, whose thousand-year alliance with the Kazuki clan had preserved secrets that could reshape the world's understanding of its own history. The giant elephant's punishment for crimes committed 8 centuries earlier demonstrated that some forms of justice operated on scales that exceeded human comprehension. Guilt and redemption measured in geological time rather than individual lifespans. The road poneglyphs that held the key to reaching Laughtale represented puzzle that had waited centuries for someone with both the strength to collect the scattered pieces and the wisdom to understand their significance once. Assemble. The ancient stones were more than navigational tools. They were repositories of knowledge that the world government had spent 800 years trying to suppress, their information-threatening foundations upon which current power structures had been built. The revelation that Odin had been both samurai and pirate, crew member of both Whitebeard and Roger, provided connection between their current adventures and the legendary figures who had shaped the previous generation's understanding of what was possible when sufficient courage was combined with proper vision. His execution at Orochi's hands had eliminated someone whose knowledge could have prevented decades of suffering, his death representing exactly the kind of waste that occurred when fear overcame wisdom in those who held power. The preparation for confronting Kaido required strategic thinking that went beyond anything Luffy had previously undertaken. The coordination of multiple crews and factions, demanding skills that had never been part of his natural repertoire. The transformation from impulsive teenager to someone capable of inspiring and coordinating complex military operations represented growth that could not be measured in terms of physical power alone. Evolution that encompassed understanding of what leadership truly meant when lives depended upon decisions made under pressure. The infiltration of Whole Cake Island marked their first direct confrontation with an emperor on her own territory. The mission to rescue Sanji, requiring operations according to principles of stealth and misdirection that contradicted every instinct Luffy had developed during years of straightforward combat. The success of their escape owed more to preparation and cooperation than to individual strength, demonstrating how much his approach to problem-solving had matured since their early adventures in East Blue Waters. Big Mom's territory represented power on a scale that dwarfed anything they had previously encountered, an emperor whose influence extended across dozens of islands, while her authority was enforced not just through personal strength, but through network of children and subordinates, whose loyalty was secured through combinations of fear, genuine affection. The anthropomorphic objects that populated her domain were not merely decorative but represented the souls of those who had failed to meet their obligations, consciousness imprisoned in inanimate forms as eternal reminder of what happened to those who disappointed her. Nami's confrontation with Cracker revealed how much she had grown since joining the crew, her mastery of weather-based combat techniques allowing her to support Luffy's extended battle against an opponent whose biscuit soldiers seemed infinitely renewable. Her ability to soften the enemy's defenses through precise application of rainfall demonstrated tactical thinking that transformed environmental conditions into weapons more effective than conventional armaments, her contribution proving essential to victory that individual strength alone could never have achieved. The wedding that served as cover for their infiltration represented more than ceremony, but political alliance designed to consolidate power that could challenge the world government's authority. The union between Sanji and Pudding representing merger of technologies and territories that would create capabilities no single faction could achieve alone. The assassination plot that emerged during the ceremony demonstrated how quickly celebrations could transform into battlefields when different factions possessed conflicting definitions of success that could not be reconciled through negotiation. The escape from Whole Cake Island required every lesson they had learned about cooperation and trust, each crew member's unique abilities contributing to survival in ways that demonstrated how much they had grown as functioning unit, rather than collection of individuals who happened to share transportation. The sacrifices made by allies who chose to remain behind to ensure their escape spoke to the kind of loyalty that their adventures had inspired in those who understood what they represented and why their mission mattered to everyone who dreamed of better world. As they sailed away from Big Mom's territory with Zeus as unexpected addition to Nami's arsenal, the navigator who had once stolen to survive was learning what it meant to inspire such devotion in others that they would risk everything to ensure her success, whether itself becoming ally in service to dreams that had grown far beyond personal ambition, to encompass transformation of the world itself into something worthy of the sacrifices that had been made to reach this point in their impossible journey toward horizons that held promise of wonders yet to be discovered. The approach to Wano country carried with it the weight of 20 years of accumulated suffering. The closed borders that had protected the island nation from external interference, having also served as prison walls that trapped its population under the tyrannical rule of those who had perverted every tradition and corrupted every institution that had once made their homeland worthy of pride. The waterfall that served as natural barrier between Wano and the outside world rose like a monument to isolation, its thundering cascade creating mist that obscured the summit, where an entire civilization waited in desperate need of liberation that seemed impossible until heroes arrived who specialized in achieving the impossible. Orochi's paranoid rule had transformed what should have been a paradise of samurai honor and natural beauty into a surveillance state where even the slightest deviation from approved behavior could result in death or worse. The shogun's fear of rebellion having created conditions that made rebellion inevitable, while his cruelty ensured that when revolution finally came, it would be merciless in its application of justice. Too long delayed, the snake that had usurped legitimate authority understood that his position depended entirely upon preventing the truth about the past from reaching ears that might be inspired to action by knowledge of what had been stolen from them. Kaido's overwhelming strength had made such tyranny possible through the simple expedient of eliminating anyone whose power might threaten the established order. The King of the Beasts, having earned his reputation through systematic destruction of everyone who dared to challenge his authority, while his devil fruit abilities made him seem invincible to opponents who measured strength in conventional terms. The dragon that ruled from Onigashima had convinced an entire generation that resistance was futile, that acceptance of oppression was preferable to the certain death that would follow any attempt at defiance. The fire festival that would serve as cover for their revolution represented celebration of traditions that Orochi had tried to suppress. The lighting of lanterns carrying wishes that had been deferred for 2 decades while their authors waited for circumstances that would make fulfillment possible, rather than merely fantasies shared in whispered conversations. The symbolism of launching their rebellion during such observance added weight to their cause that went beyond mere military strategy to encompass cultural restoration, the reclamation of identity that had been systematically attacked by those who understood that destroying people's understanding of themselves was more effective than merely conquering their bodies. The alliance that had assembled to challenge Kaido's rule represented the largest coalition ever formed in opposition to a Yonko's authority. Pirates and samurai and minks, united by shared recognition that some injustices were too great to be endured, regardless of the personal costs that resistance might demand from those brave enough to take up arms against overwhelming odds. The Ninja Pirate Mink Samurai Alliance existed not because its members shared identical goals, but because they understood that their individual objectives could only be achieved through collective action against forces too powerful for any single faction to challenge alone. Nami's role in the assault on Onigashima extended far beyond navigation to encompass tactical coordination and environmental manipulation that would prove crucial for operations conducted across multiple fronts simultaneously, her weather-based abilities providing support that could shift the balance in individual conflicts, while her understanding of the fortress's layout helped guide Allied forces through passages that would otherwise have been impenetrable mazes. The perfect climate act that had been enhanced through her training on Witheria was about to face its ultimate test against enemies whose power had been refined through decades of unchallenged dominance. The skull-shaped fortress that crowned Kaido's island stronghold was designed not just for defense but for psychological impact. Its architecture, declaring to everyone who saw it that death ruled this domain, and that challenging its authority would result in nothing except adding more bones to the foundation upon which its power was built. Yet the same symbolism that was meant to intimidate attackers also served to inspire those who understood that some principles were worth dying for. The recognition that they were literally storming the gates of hell, making their courage all the more remarkable for being consciously chosen rather than arising from ignorance of the dangers they faced. The initial assault proceeded according to plans that had been refined through careful study of the fortress's defenses and the behavioral patterns of its inhabitants. But no amount of preparation could have anticipated the full scope of complications that would emerge. Once battle was joined, and the fog of war began to obscure careful calculations, with the chaos that characterized all conflicts where survival depended upon split-second decisions made under pressure that would have paralyzed less experienced warriors. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining focus on ultimate objectives became more important than any specific tactical advantage they might have possessed at the operation's beginning. Nami's confrontation with Ulti and Page 1 represented her evolution from someone who avoided direct combat whenever possible to a warrior capable of holding her own against opponents whose physical capabilities should have made victory impossible through conventional means. The ancient Zoan powers that the Tobi Roppo possessed created tactical challenges that required creative applications of weather manipulation. Her ability to generate lightning storms in enclosed spaces providing advantages that their dinosaur forms could not counter, despite their overwhelming strength and natural weaponry. The partnership with Usopp that developed during their battle against the Flying Six demonstrated how much both of them had grown since their early adventures, their coordination allowing them to achieve victory against enemies who would have destroyed them individually, while their mutual trust enabled tactical innovations that neither could have conceived alone. The sniper's ability to create openings through precise applications of his pop green techniques provided perfect complements to her meteorological attacks, their teamwork representing synthesis of different skill sets that created capabilities exceeding what either possessed independently. The revelation that Big Mom had followed them to Wano created complications that transformed an already impossible situation into something that defied rational analysis. The presence of two Yonko in the same location representing concentration of power that no alliance should have been able to challenge successfully regardless of how many allies they managed to assemble. The temporary cooperation between the emperors created a nightmare scenario that tested every assumption their strategic planning had been based upon, forcing real-time adaptations to circumstances that their most pessimistic projections had not anticipated. Tama's devil fruit ability to transform enemy gifters into allies provided exactly the kind of battlefield advantage that could shift the balance in conflicts where numbers mattered as much as individual strength. Her power to reprogram the loyalty of artificial Zoan users, creating cascade effects that disrupted Kaido's forces from within, while providing reinforcements that multiplied the effectiveness of existing allied units. The little girl whose courage had impressed Ace years earlier was finally able to contribute meaningfully to the kind of adventure she had always dreamed of joining, her participation representing a bridge between past and present that honored the memory of those who had died while ensuring that their sacrifices would not be meaningless. The roof battle that pitted the new generation against the old represented climactic confrontation between different visions of what the world could become. The supernovas who had challenged the established order, finally facing opponents whose power had shaped that order for decades, while their determination to create something better was tested against the cynical realism of those who had survived long enough to reach the pinnacle of their profession. The techniques that were displayed during this ultimate conflict pushed the boundaries of what human bodies could endure while demonstrating applications of haki that had previously been theoretical rather than practical. Luffy's awakening of his devil fruit's true nature transformed the battle's fundamental parameters. By revealing that the rubber powers everyone had understood to be relatively limited were actually expression of abilities that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of what was possible when sufficient will was combined with proper knowledge. Gear 5th represented not just another technique but complete paradigm shift that made previous limitations irrelevant. The sun gods returned to the world, bringing joy and freedom as weapons more powerful than any conventional armament. The defeat of Kaido marked the end of an era that had been defined by the principle that might made right, the king of the beasts' fall, proving that even the strongest creatures could be overcome when opposed by sufficient determination, combined with proper understanding of what strength actually meant when it was not corrupted by the Raya desire to dominate others. The dragon's plummet into the earth beneath Wano carried symbolic weight that reached far beyond immediate tactical implications, representing the burial of old ways of thinking that had made such tyranny possible in the first place. Nami's contributions to the victory went beyond individual combat prowess to encompass the kind of tactical support and environmental manipulation that made complex operations possible. Her weather control abilities, providing cover for allies while hampering enemies, in ways that shifted the balance in dozens of smaller conflicts, whose outcomes collectively determined the battle's ultimate resolution. The lightning strikes that she coordinated with Zeus's enhanced capabilities served as artillery support that no conventional force could have provided. Her mastery of atmospheric phenomena, transforming the very air above Onigashima into a weapon that served their cause. The moment when Onigashima's floating trajectory was finally halted represented triumph of collective will over forces that should have been unstoppable. The combined efforts of multiple allies working in perfect coordination to prevent catastrophe that would have claimed thousands of innocent lives, regardless of who emerged victorious from the conflicts raging throughout the fortress. The techniques that were required to arrest the island's momentum pushed several participants beyond their normal limitations. Their willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of protecting others, demonstrating exactly the kind of heroism that Wano's liberation had demanded from the beginning. The celebration that erupted throughout Wano when news of their victory spread from the flower capital to the most remote villages represented joy that had been building for 20 years while waiting for circumstances that would make its expressions safe rather than suicidal. The lanterns that had carried wishes during the fire festival were answered in ways that exceeded their author's most optimistic projections. Dreams that had seemed impossible when they were first conceived finally becoming reality through the application of courage that had been refined in the crucible of shared suffering. Yamato's decision to remain in Wano rather than joining the Straw Hat Pirates created a moment of profound understanding for Luffy about the nature of dreams and duty. His recognition that some aspirations required accepting responsibilities that contradicted personal preferences while serving purposes that transcended individual satisfaction. The bond that had formed between them during the battle was strong enough to survive physical separation, their mutual respect creating connection that distance could not diminish, regardless of how far their respective journeys might carry them from this shared moment of victory. The revelation that Pluton lay hidden beneath Wano's surface added another layer of complexity to the world's emerging power structure, while demonstrating that some secrets were too dangerous to be revealed regardless of how much their disclosure might benefit those who possessed the Prosen knowledge. The ancient weapon that could reshape entire continents remained buried, not through ignorance, but through wisdom, recognition that some forms of power could not be safely wielded by anyone regardless of their intentions or moral character. The departure from Wano carried with it a sense of completion that was both satisfying and melancholic, their objective achieved but at costs that would require years to fully process and understand. The bonds that had been forged through shared struggle created connections that would influence future decisions, regardless of how much distance or time might separate them from the people whose courage had made victory possible. Their experiences in the land of Wano serving as foundation for whatever challenges awaited them in waters that held promise of adventures exceeding anything they had previously imagined. The recognition of Luffy as one of the 4 emperors of the sea represented acknowledgement by the world at large that fundamental shifts in power were occurring, changes that could not be ignored or dismissed as temporary aberrations that would correct themselves without intervention from those whose authority depended upon maintaining existing hierarchies. The bounty increases that accompanied this elevation reflected not just individual achievements, but collective recognition that they had evolved beyond the categories that had previously defined criminal threats to established order. Nami's own bounty of 366 million berries marked her transformation from talented navigator, who happened to associate with dangerous individuals, into someone whose skills and knowledge made her personally threatening to those who profited from maintaining systems of oppression and exploitation. The Weather Witch, whose abilities could influence entire battles, was no longer mere supporting character in other people's stories, but protagonist whose choices would help determine the shape of whatever world emerged from the conflicts that were reshaping the balance of power throughout the Power Grand Line. The approach to their next adventure carried anticipation that was tempered by understanding of how much the stakes had been raised through their success in Wano. The recognition that future enemies would be prepared for opponents who had proven capable of toppling Yonko, making stealth and surprise less viable tactical options, while demanding innovations in strategy that went beyond anything they had previously been required to develop. The crew that had begun their journey as a collection of dreamers sharing transportation had evolved into force that could challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which their world's power structures had been built. But perhaps most importantly for Nami personally, the victory in Wano had provided final proof that the family she had chosen was capable of achieving objectives that had seemed impossible when evaluated according to conventional standards, their bonds strong enough to support whatever weight the future might place upon them, while their shared commitment to principles that transcended individual advantage created foundation for adventures that would test every assumption about what small groups of dedicated individuals could accomplish when they refused to accept that change was impossible. The maps she would create of their Wano adventures would serve as historical documents that future generations could use to understand how tyranny had been defeated, not through overwhelming force, but through the application of courage, friendship, and determination to create a world where such oppression could never again take root in soil that had been watered with the blood of those who understood that some principles were worth any sacrifice required to preserve them for those who would inherit whatever tomorrow their struggles made possible. From the ashes of Oikot Kingdom to the heights of Onigashima, from a frightened child clutching stolen coins to a navigator whose weather magic helps topple emperors, Nami's journey reminds us that the most accurate maps are drawn not in ink, but in the choices we make when faced with impossible odds. Her true treasure was never the 100 million berries she once sought, but the family she found in the most unlikely places. The trust she learned to give, despite every reason for suspicion, and the courage to dream of mapping a world worth exploring. The tangerine trees that grow aboard the Thousand Sunny bear fruit sweet enough to honor Belmare's sacrifice while nourishing the adventures yet to come. Every chart Nami draws carries forward the love of a marine who chose motherhood over safety, the wisdom of a sister who understood necessary lies, and the hope of a village that never stopped believing in the girl who carried their dreams across the seas. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that somewhere on the vast ocean, a navigator guides her family toward horizons where the impossible becomes inevitable, where dreams chart the course to tomorrow's dawn.